Welcome back to Lullaby Atlas. Tonight we follow the gentle story of Joseph. Close your eyes, let the world fall away. Before the sun has cleared the ridge, the hill country of Canaan lies in a gray-gold haze, the terrace slopes still cool, still damp from the night. Goat-hair tents crouch low against the hillside, their dark panels barely distinguishable from the rocks among which they are pegged. A flock stirs on the lower ground, the soft percussion of hooves on dry earth, the tearing sound of browsing, a lamb's thin voice carrying up through the still air. Wood smoke drifts sideways from a low fire, thin and pale, and the world smells of wool and dust and the faint sweetness of juniper on the morning wind. A stone well stands at the foot of the slope, its rim worn smooth by many hands and many mornings. The rope lies coiled over the edge, dark with water, cold to the touch. Around the well, the flock gathers in its unhurried way. Sheep and goats pressing together, their breath rising in small white clouds. And among them, a boy moves quietly, lifting a strayed kid back toward the group, his robe catching the first weak light. He is young, and there is something alert in the way he holds himself, something attentive, as if he is always half listening for something the hills have not yet said. His name is Joseph, and his father loves him with the particular tenderness of old age. The father is Jacob, a man who has lived a long and wandering life, who has pitched his tents in the land where his own fathers had lived, in the land of Canaan, and who holds this boy, the son of his beloved Rachel, as if holding something he had once nearly lost. In the evenings, when the fire burns low and the stars begin, it is Joseph he calls to sit nearest him. Joseph, whose shoulder he touches when words are not enough. The other sons feel that preference as a man feels a change in the weather, in the bones, without speaking of it. Then there is the coat. It is told that Jacob had it made for the boy, a long robe of many dyed strips, ornamented at the hem and the cuffs, sewn of colored cloth in a world where most men wore the gray-brown of undyed wool. It is a garment that announces itself. It cannot be unseen. On an ordinary hillside, among ordinary flocks, it moves through the grayness like a thing lit from within. Crimson and ochre and deep blue, the colors of dye stuff and patience and considerable expense. Jacob placed it on his son's shoulders himself, smoothing the cloth down as the old do with gifts they have waited a long time to give. Among the brothers, and there were 10 older than Joseph, 10 grown men with their own flocks and their own fires, the coat was seen, and nothing was said. That silence had a texture to it, dense and still the way air goes still before a storm. They did not speak ill, they did not raise their voices. At the evening meal they passed the bread and the oil and the dried figs as always, and the fire crackled, and a night bird called somewhere across the valley. And everything was ordinary, and nothing was ordinary. Joseph sat close to his father in his colored robe and did not yet know, the way the young do not know, what the silence meant. The days in the hill country had a particular rhythm. The flock moved, the sun climbed and fell, water was drawn and drunk, bread was made and eaten. Joseph learned the paths the sheep preferred, the hollow where the best grass held on through the dry months, the sound the led goat made before rain. He carried the coat on some days and left it folded on other days, and when he wore it on the hillside, the colored cloth caught the afternoon light from a long way off. A small, bright thing moving among the gray-brown of the world, visible to anyone watching from above or below. It was in those hills that the dreams came to him. The old story says they came on 2 separate nights, clean and vivid the way some dreams are, carrying a weight of meaning even before the waking mind can name it. The first came in the harvest season, when the air smelled of cut stalks and dry chaff and the warmth of gathered grain. In the dream, Joseph was in a field with his brothers, and they were binding sheaves. bundling the cut wheat into tall, upright columns the way harvesters do, their hands fragrant with the dusty green of the straw. And then something shifted in the dream, as things shift in dreams. His sheaf rose and stood upright in the center of the field, tall and golden, its bound waist tight with cord. And the other sheaves, slowly, gently, without force, turned and bowed toward it, as a reed bows toward moving water, as a flower bends toward the warmth of the sun. That was all. No voice, no explanation, only the image, one sheaf standing and all the others inclining, and the light over the field very still and very gold, and the smell of ripe grain filling the dream as it had filled the day before. Joseph woke with the image behind his eyes, so clear he could have reached out and touched the straw. He told the dream aloud, as the young do, not with pride, only with the urgency of something that feels important. And the brothers heard it and felt that familiar coolness settle again between them and their youngest brother. The telling changed nothing in the daily life of the camp. The fire was stoked, the bread was turned on the stone, the flock was counted at dusk as always. But the dream lived on in the air of the camp, like the scent of something, faint but persistent. Jacob heard the dream too, and a small quiet settled on the old man's face, something between wonder and unease, the way one feels when a saying proves truer than expected. The second dream came not long after, and this one was larger, wider, taller, reaching up beyond the field into the whole of the night sky. The story says Joseph dreamed he looked up and saw the sun and the moon and 11 stars, and that each of them turned as the sheaves had turned and inclined toward him in that same slow, deliberate, inexplicable bow. 11 stars. The night sky of Canaan is very old and very deep, and the stars there are bright enough to cast pale shadows on the dry ground. In the dream, those stars moved, and in their movement there was something that felt like recognition, like a name spoken very quietly in a crowded room. Joseph told this dream too. The words came out over the morning meal, among the smell of goat's milk and the small sounds of the camp waking. And when he finished speaking, a silence held that was longer than the first one. Even his father spoke this time, gently but with a note of something like caution. "What is this dream you have dreamed?" he said. "And must your mother and I and all your brothers come and bow ourselves to you?" He said it as a father says a hard thing with love inside it. And then the morning went on, and the flock was led out, and the sun rose over the eastern ridge and burned away the last of the gray gold mist. And yet, the old story says this quietly, the father kept the dream in his heart. That is the way of old men who have themselves been surprised by life, who have slept in stony places and woken to find the world changed. Jacob kept the dream as one keeps a folded thing, not displaying it, not discarding it, only setting it somewhere close and leaving it there. The colored coat hung on its peg inside the tent. Outside, the flock moved on the hills in the long gold light of afternoon, and the dust settled on the paths the sheep had worn in the chalk and clay, and the dreams drifted in the air of the camp like seeds waiting for the right kind of ground. There was one more ordinary season in Canaan before the story turned. The flock grazed, the rains came and went, the almond trees flowered white against the dark hills in the cold month. Joseph grew a little taller, and the coat fit him as a coat does when a boy is still finding his height. A little long in the hem, a little wide at the shoulder, perfect in the way of a thing made with room for growing into. He carried water from the well on the mornings when the older brothers were away, the rope rough and cold in his hands, the bucket heavy, the smell of the cold, dark water rising from the cistern's mouth into the warm morning air. His brothers had gone north with the greater part of the flock, to Shechem first, the old story says, and then further, to the valley near Dothan, where the winter grass held on. Days passed, and Jacob grew watchful in the way of fathers whose sons are out of sight and beyond the hill. He would stand at the tent door in the early morning with his hand shielding his eyes, reading the horizon for the small dark shapes of a returning flock. At last he called Joseph to him and spoke quietly, "Your brothers are pasturing the flock near Dothan. Go and find them and bring me word of them and of the flocks." The boy set out in his colored coat under a high, wide sky. The road to Dothan was a long one, a day and more through hills that grew lower and then flattened toward the northern plain. The coat was warm in the morning and a little heavy by midday. He walked the way that young men walk when they are alone on a road, and the road is long, at first quickly, then steadily, then in the particular patient rhythm of someone who has stopped counting the distance and started simply walking. Somewhere in the middle of the journey, a man met him in a field and pointed him north, toward the valley where the flocks had moved. He thanked the man and went on, and the coat caught the afternoon light behind him as he descended toward the plain. He saw the flocks before he saw his brothers, that moving gray-white blur on the valley floor that is always unmistakably sheep, always accompanied by its own soft noise of bells and hooves and the dry tearing of grass. He walked toward them through the low scrub, and the coat moved on his shoulders in the wind coming off the plain, crimson and ochre and deep blue, visible from a great distance. The brothers saw him coming before he reached them. They knew the coat. What passed between them in those moments was spoken in low voices that the old story does not trouble to repeat. Only the outcome matters, and the outcome was a kind of hardening, a decision formed in silence among men far from home. The old story is told gently, and this moment is told as gently as it can be told. There was a dry cistern nearby, one of the stone-lined wells that farmers sink in the valley floor to catch the winter rain, now empty in the dry season, its mouth a dark circle in the pale earth. They took the coat from his shoulders, the coat of many colors, the coat his father had given him, and they lowered the boy into the cistern, and the darkness closed around him, and above him the sky was a pale and distant circle of blue. The coat was carried away. The hills were very quiet. A bird crossed the sky above the cistern mouth and was gone. Then, at some distance, came the sound of camel bells. A caravan was moving along the road that ran across the valley toward Egypt. Ishmaelite traders, the old story says, carrying spices and balm and myrrh, the fragrant cargo of a long southward journey. The bells made their particular sound, deep, unhurried, resonant, the sound of distance being crossed. Judah, one of the brothers, spoke, and in the end the decision shifted and Joseph was brought up out of the cistern. He was sold to the traders for 20 pieces of silver, the old story says, a number spoken plain and bare without comment. The caravan moved on. The dust it raised on the valley roads slowly settled. The brothers killed a goat. They dipped the coat, the long ornamented coat of colored cloth, the coat their father had smoothed down over Joseph's shoulders, into the blood and carried it home. When they laid it before Jacob, the old man knew it at once. He tore his garments in grief. He mourned his son for many days and would not be comforted. The coat lay where it had been set down, its colors dimmed, its embroidery still, the most beloved thing made unbearable. And yet it still existed, that coat, and somewhere far to the south, in a caravan making its patient way toward Egypt, the boy its father had made it for also still existed. The hills of Canaan held that silence, and the stars came out. The caravan moved through the night and the following days, south and west, following the road that men had followed between Canaan and Egypt since longer ago than memory. The stars that had bowed in Joseph's dream wheeled overhead in their old patterns, the same stars above the tent where his father wept, the same stars above the road where the camels walked with their long, unhurried stride. The boy in the caravan did not know, on that first night, what the dreams had meant, or when or whether they would ever come true. He was young, and the road was long, and Egypt was still very far away. But the dream had been dreamed, and something in the world had quietly begun to move. The morning came slowly to the hills of Canaan, gray and cool, the dew still dark on the stones. Old Jacob had risen before the light, as fathers do when worry has kept them from rest, and he stood at the tent door watching the horizon pale. He called Joseph to him gently and laid on the boy an errand that only a beloved son would be trusted to carry. Go north, find your brothers, find the flocks, and bring word back that all is well. It was a simple thing. The old man did not know it would be years before he heard any word at all. We go out now with the boy on his father's errand. Joseph set off northward through the terraced hills, the embroidered coat bright against the pale dust of the road, his sandals already powdering white before the sun had climbed a hand's breadth above the ridge. The land was dry and vast and very quiet at that hour. Only the distant complaint of a goat somewhere below and the thin whistle of a bird moving through the scrub. The valley dropped away on either side in long folds of chalk and thorn, and the road ahead was empty and white and very long. He came first to Shechem, that old valley town where the brothers had gone with the flocks some weeks before. He moved through the familiar passes, the smell of wild sage crushed underfoot, the limestone bluffs going amber as the sun rose and the air warmed toward the full heat of midday. But at Shechem the flocks were not to be found, and the grazing grounds were empty, the grass cropped close and the dung already dry. He stood in a wide field with a silence around him, and the sky enormous and blue overhead, a boy alone on the face of a large, unhurried world. It is told that a man found him wandering in the fields, this bright-coated boy turning slowly, as if listening to the land for direction. The stranger had the sun-browned look of one who spent his days out of doors, and his manner was unhurried and kind. Joseph asked after his brothers, asked after the flocks, and the man said simply that he had heard them speak of moving north, further north toward Dothan. A word given freely in a field, a pointing hand, a road indicated, and that was all. The boy gave thanks and turned his feet toward Dothan, not knowing what waited there beneath the indifferent sky. The road to Dothan was longer, and the sun was full by the time he came over the last rise and saw the green of the valley below, startling after so much pale stone and dust. The flocks were there, dark dots moving slowly across the distant grass, and somewhere among them the brothers, and the smell of the camp, the lanolin-heavy warmth of sheep, the ash of a cooking fire carried up on a thin trail of smoke. Joseph began to descend toward them, the coat catching the afternoon light, visible from a long way off to anyone watching from the valley floor. What moved in the brothers' hearts in that moment, when they looked up from the valley floor and saw the bright coat coming down the hill? The old story does not linger there, and neither will this telling. What matters is simpler and sadder. The coat was seen from a distance, and the resentment that had been sitting like a stone in the chest for many months now had its moment. The boy came down gladly, perhaps calling out, perhaps smiling into the valley, not yet reading the stillness that had fallen over the camp, not yet hearing the silence that meant something had already been decided. The telling is gentle here and swift. There was a cistern in the ground near the camp, one of those old round stone-mouthed wells, cut deep into the earth for water that was no longer there, dry and cool in its deep dark throat, the walls furred with old moss gone brittle. The coat was taken from the boy, and he was let down into the cistern, and the rope was pulled back up. The old story does not dwell on what was said, and this telling will not either. What the eye rests on instead is the round, dark mouth of the cistern from above, and the silence of the hills around it, and the flock grazing nearby as if nothing at all had changed. the hills held their stillness. A hawk turned in a high circle over the valley, riding the warm air with great patience, and the thorn scrub on the slopes moved faintly in a breath of wind, and the light on the stone was the color of old honey. Then, from the south, from the road that wound down through the passes toward the lowlands and then the long desert road to Egypt, came a sound that traveled far in that dry air, the soft, rhythmic chime of bells. Camel bells, many of them, and the low mutter of laden animals, and the creak of bundles shifting with each long stride. A caravan was coming up the road from Gilead. They were Ishmaelite traders, and with them Midianite merchants, bound for Egypt with their camels strapped with bundles of spice and balm and myrrh, those warm, resinous things that the markets of Egypt would pay well to receive. The smell of them reached the hillside before the caravan itself was clearly seen, something sweet and dark and foreign on the dry Canaanite air, the smell of far places, of trade routes and long roads, of a world much wider than this valley. Their turbans and robes were the colors of worn earth and faded dye, and they moved with the unhurried purpose of men who had traveled many days and expected to travel many more. It was Judah who spoke, in the old story. Judah who looked at the caravan and then at the cistern, and said the words that changed everything, though he did not know how far those words would travel or what they would one day become. The boy was lifted out of the cistern and brought to the road. The transaction was brief. A count of silver pieces passed from one hand to another in the dry afternoon light. A small weight of metal, unremarkable, gone almost before it registered. And then the caravan moved on, and Joseph went with it, walking south, away from the hills of home, the bells of the camels ringing ahead of him and behind. The hills of Canaan grew small behind them. The road descended through the dry passes, and the scrub gave way to sand, and the sky opened out into that enormous southern blue that has no end to it. Joseph walked among the traders and their laden animals, and the smell of myrrh was all around him, and the bells kept their patient rhythm, and the dust rose and fell and settled back, and the road unreeled ahead without haste. He was a boy who had walked the hills of home all his life, and now those hills were behind him, and there was only the road, and the road led to Egypt, and Egypt was far. Behind, in the valley at Dothan, the brothers took the embroidered coat and brought it to an animal, to a goat, and the coat came back stained dark. They had already decided what they would say, and the words they had chosen were few and simple and gave nothing away. They would say, "We found this." They would let the coat speak the lie for them. So they folded it. Or perhaps they did not fold it carefully. Perhaps it was carried crumpled, held at arm's length. And they turned their faces toward home, toward Hebron, toward the old man who was waiting for word that all was well. Jacob saw them coming from a long way off, as he had watched the horizon each evening since Joseph left. He saw the coat before he understood it, held out toward him, and the old story says that he understood all at once, and that his knees knew what his mind had not yet spoken. He took the coat into his hands, those hands that had held every one of his sons as infants, that had rested on Joseph's head in blessing, that had smoothed the same bright cloth when he gave it, and he held it in the lamplight and did not speak for a long moment. He refused to be comforted. The old story says this plainly and simply, and it is one of the most honest lines in all the telling. His sons and daughters came to him, and they sat with him, and words were offered, the ordinary words of consolation, but Jacob would not take them. A father who has lost a child does not want consolation. He wants only his child. The tents went quiet around him as the night came on, and the lamp burned steadily, and the coat lay in his arms, and the night was very still. Outside, the stars came out over the hills of Canaan, one by one, in their unhurried multitude. The empty doorway of the tent held the darkness quietly. A staff leaned against the tent pole. A bowl of olives sat untouched beside the lamp. These were the small, ordinary things of a life that had not changed. The same tent, the same hillside, the same flock shifting on the slope below with their soft bells. And yet everything was altered. The coat was not hanging on its peg. The boy was not sleeping in his usual place. The space where Joseph had been was now just space. And space, in a tent that has known a beloved child, is a very loud thing. And the caravan moved on. Miles away, already on the long road south, the bells of the traders' camels kept their soft iron count against the dark, and the smell of myrrh and spice rode the night air, and the stars were enormous overhead, and the sand was cool underfoot after the heat of the day. Joseph walked or rode among the traders, and the night was around him on all sides, and the road was long, and Egypt was still far ahead, and everything he had known was behind him now, growing smaller with every step of the camel's patient stride. The hills of Canaan were a dark shape against the sky, and then they were gone. The old story holds this moment with great tenderness: the boy and the road and the stars and the long way ahead. The dreamer who had seen the sun and the moon and 11 stars bow down was himself now bent low by a road he had not chosen. And yet the dreams had been dreamed. They existed now somewhere in the world, the way a seed exists beneath winter ground, without showing anything, without asking for anything, simply waiting in the dark for what the seasons would bring. The bells rang softly, the camels walked, the stars turned overhead in their slow ancient wheel, and the road continued south. We follow him now down into Egypt. The desert gave way slowly, the sand growing softer, the air carrying something new, a green, living heaviness, thick with the smell of river mud and reed and lotus, so different from the dry sage and stone dust of the hills of Canaan that the boy breathed it in like a man tasting water after a long thirst. The sky ahead lightened into a pale gold, and the road curved at last around a low ridge, and there it was, the Nile, lying broad and silver through the flattest, greenest land the world had ever made. Nothing in the shepherd boy's life had prepared him for a thing so large and so still. The river did not rush. It moved the way time moves, with absolute unhurried authority. And on both banks the fields stretched away in every direction, impossibly green, the barley and emmer wheat already beginning to catch the early light in long, slow ripples. Reed birds called from the papyrus thickets along the bank. White ibises stood at the edge of the water, perfectly motionless, as though they had been standing there since before memory, and perhaps they had. White sails moved on the water, slow and angular, their linen catching the wind and holding it. Reed boats, lower and darker, worked in closer to shore where the fishermen drew their nets hand over hand and the wet ropes gleamed. On the far bank, a town of mud brick rose in tiers, its walls plastered and whitened, pigeons circling above the flat rooftops in a loose, easy wheel. Smoke rose from cook fires, pale against the blue. The smell of fish drying on racks by the water came across on the breeze, warm and salt and ancient. And then, further south, on the 3rd or 4th day of traveling the river road, the boy saw them, pale shapes on the horizon, too regular for hills, too enormous for any building a human mind could casually hold. The pyramids. They rose from the desert edge at the far side of the valley with a kind of patient immensity, their limestone flanks catching the afternoon light and throwing it back as a pale, almost white fire. They had been standing for ages longer than the oldest story anyone in Canaan had ever told, and they would stand for ages more. Along the road that skirted the valley, the boy passed temple pylons that rose like two great stone hands pressed together, their surfaces carved from top to bottom in lines of picture writing that told, in a language he could not read, stories older than his own people's oldest memories. The paint on those carvings was still vivid in places, red ochre and lapis blue and a deep, sure black, and the figures shown were long-limbed and certain, performing their eternal tasks with a precision that spoke of a tradition so deep it had become the very shape of beauty. It was wondrous, it was not wrong, it simply was, old, grave, and holy itself. He passed through a gateway into a hall of columns, each one shaped like a great bundle of papyrus stalks bound together, their capitals spreading wide at the top like the flowers opening above water. The columns were as tall as trees, and between them the light fell in long amber shafts, warm and thick with the scent of cedar resin and something sweeter, the offerings left that morning on the stone altars, already drying in the dry warmth of the hall. Against the back wall, stone statues sat in silence, a figure with a falcon's head, a figure with a jackal's, each carved with such sureness of line that they seemed not made but revealed. The stone merely parted to show what had always been inside. The boy from the hills of Canaan, who had grown up counting his wealth in goats and understanding sky and stone and the smell of rain on limestone, walked through all of this with the particular stillness of someone who does not yet have words for what they are seeing. He did not reach for words, he simply looked, and the looking changed him in some quiet way that he would not have been able to name even if he had tried. Egypt was not like anything. Egypt was Egypt, the oldest, most wondrous, most abundantly itself place the world had made, and it held him now the way a river holds everything it carries, without explanation, without apology, simply flowing. The caravan came at last to the great city, where the market ran along a canal and the voices of traders wove together in a sound like water over stones. Many languages, many accents, the smell of spiced oil and dried fish and raw linen bales stacked taller than a man's head. Here the Midianites made their transactions, the boy among the goods they offered. And here a man came who wore the bearing of one long accustomed to authority, an officer of Pharaoh called Potiphar, captain of the guard. The story does not stay long in the market. The story turns instead toward a house. The house of the captain of the guard was a world contained behind its mud brick walls, cool and ordered and smelling of cedar oil and damp earth, where the garden was watered twice each day. In the entry courtyard, tall storage jars stood in rows along the wall, each one sealed with a clay stopper and marked with a symbol pressed into the clay while it was still wet. Barley here, oil there, wine a little further along, in jars whose dark bellies held the harvest of the last good season. The floor under the boy's feet was packed earth, cool even at midday, and it smelled of the old clean comfort of a household that had been well kept for a long time. Through an inner doorway, the courtyard opened onto a garden, a small rectangular pool, its surface dark and still, bordered by persea trees whose leaves made a sound like a very soft breath when the afternoon air moved through them. Lotus grew in the pool's shallower edges, their pink flowers already closing as the sun tilted west, and a duck moved across the far end of the water without disturbing it, leaving only the faintest of rings spreading outward and outward until they were nothing. It was the kind of garden that someone had tended with long, faithful attention, and the care of it showed in every quiet corner. At evening, the lamps were lit, small clay lamps the size of a cupped palm, each one filled with castor oil and drawing its flame up through a linen wick. They were placed in niches in the mud brick walls and on the edges of the low tables, and they turned the interior of the house into a world of warm, moving amber, the walls coming alive with the slow dance of shadows that made everything seem to breathe gently. The boy sat in this light and understood, for the first time, that this was where he would sleep, that this, for now, for a season he could not yet measure, was home. The old story says, gently and without explanation, that the God of his fathers was said to be with the young man there, far from every hill and tent and face he had ever loved, so that whatever his hands turned to, it seemed to prosper. Perhaps it was only that he worked with the particular care of someone who has nothing left to spend his attention on but the task in front of him. Perhaps it was something quieter and older than that. The story does not explain it. It simply notes it, the way one notes a good harvest or a river running full, as a fact of the world, gentle and given. The days settled into a rhythm. He learned the weight of Egyptian measures, the system of the sealed jars, and the tallying reed that counted what came in and what went out. He learned the names of the trees in the garden and what they needed, the particular clay soil near the wall where the herbs grew best, the rotation of the night watch, and the care of the ox teams that brought in the estate's grain. He learned it all with the patience of a man who understands that a thing worth knowing is worth knowing slowly and completely, and the household began, almost without noticing, to arrange itself around his quiet competence. The Nile itself was a kind of teacher for those patient enough to attend to it. Once each year, without fail, without being asked, the river rose. It rose from some deep southern source that no one in Egypt had ever seen and filled, and came north in a slow, dark, generous flood that spread across the valley and left behind, when it receded, a layer of black silt as fine and rich as anything a field could be given. The Egyptians called this the gift, and they had built their whole civilization on the faith that the river would return, that the pattern held, that the flood would come, that the land would be made ready again. After the flood came the planting, the sowers moving through the black fields in the early morning when the air was still cool and the shadows long, scattering emmer wheat by hand in long sweeping arcs, each throw a kind of prayer the body made without words. Then came the green, impossibly green, the first shoots coming through the dark earth in neat rows, and the birds that came to eat them, and the boys who drove the birds away with noise and running. The estate held fields beyond the city's edge, and the young man from Canaan walked those fields now as a steward, counting and noting and caring. Linen dried on lines strung between the persea trees, long white lengths of it, moving very slowly in the afternoon breeze off the river, their whiteness almost painful against the blue of the sky. The women of the household brought the dried linen in at evening, folding it with the precise, practiced movements of a domestic art that had been performed in this house for generations. And the smell of it, clean and slightly sweet, dried in river air, filled the inner rooms as the lamps were lit. It was the smell of order, of things tended, of a household in the deep, ordinary grace of being well run. And so the months passed, and the seasons, the flood and the sowing and the harvest and the dry season, when the dust came up from the western desert and softened everything it touched, and the young man grew into the steward's role as a hand grows into a tool that fits it perfectly. The estate prospered. Potiphar, the captain, it is said, paid very little attention to the management of his household because he found he did not need to. Everything was in order. Everything was accounted for. And there was a particular ease in a man's bearing when he knows, without having to check, that what he is responsible for is being cared for well. In the evenings, when the work was done and the lamps were burning low, the Nile was still audible at a distance, not as rushing water, but as a deep, continuous murmur, the sound of something vast and indifferent, moving through the world at its own pace, returning again and again, faithful in the only way that rivers are faithful, not because they choose to be, but because they are. The boy listened to it some nights from the flat roof of the storehouse, where the air was cooler and the stars were bright and very close, and the palm fronds down below made their dry, papery sound against each other, and the city breathed around him in the dark. He carried the dreams with him always, the way one carries something both precious and bewildering. The sheaves bowing, the sun and moon and the 11 stars, and they seemed here in this immense country of rivers and stone and painted walls, simultaneously very far away and quietly present, like a word heard in childhood that one does not understand until much later, when the right circumstances at last arrange themselves around it and the meaning opens, simply and completely, like a field after rain. Egypt did not diminish the dreams. Egypt held them the way deep water holds a stone, enclosing it, patient with it, keeping it safe for the moment it would be needed. And so the young man settled into Egypt's ancient rhythm, tended what had been placed in his hands, and waited, not with the hard impatience of someone counting days, but with the particular deep patience of someone who has learned, in the way that only the very young sometimes manage to learn it, that the seasons do not hurry, and that the river returns whether one watches for it or not. The house was quiet. The store jars stood full. The garden pool lay still in the last of the evening light, and a single lamp burned on in the inner room, steady and small against all that enormous, beautiful dark. It is enough for now to rest here. Morning came to the house of Potiphar with the sound of water, the servants drawing it up in clay jars from the garden cistern, while the air still held the cool of night. The flagstone floors stayed cold underfoot even as the sun climbed, and the rooms smelled of pressed linen and sesame oil and the faint green breath of the ornamental pool. Joseph moved through those rooms with the ease of a man who has found his work and loves it, checking the stores of emmer grain, counting the sealed amphorae, setting each thing in its ordered place before the heat of the day settled over everything like a warm hand. The garden pool was the heart of the house at the end of each day, when the captain of the guard returned from his duties, and the household gathered in its quiet way around that still green water. Lotus blossoms closed at dusk, folding their pale pink petals slowly as if remembering sleep, and the reflected sky deepened from copper to violet to the first soft black. A fig tree at the wall's edge dropped one ripe fruit into the water, and the rings spread outward in slow circles and vanished, and the evening was as whole and unhurried as a long, even breath. Trust had been given slowly, and slowly it had deepened into something that shaped the whole texture of those days. His master handed him the ring of household keys, and the weight of that iron ring in his palm was a kind of language. It said, "Everything here is in your care." The stewards of the grain answered to him. The linen keepers brought their tallies to him. Even the merchants at the outer gate waited on his word before unloading their bolts of cloth and their bundles of dried fish. He carried it all with a steadiness that the household had come to lean on, the way they leaned on the roof beams and the thick mud walls against the summer heat. The storerooms were magnificent in their fullness at the height of the season, sack after sack of grain standing in rows along the back wall, stoppered jars of olive oil catching the lamplight in their glazed shoulders, dried herbs bundled and hanging from the ceiling beams so that the air in those low rooms smelled of thyme and warm dust and something sweetly resinous. A cat slept on a grain sack in the corner, one ear twitching at the sound of mice. Joseph walked the length of the room in the half-dark, touching the sacks as he went, satisfied in the quiet way of a man who has counted everything and found it sufficient. The lamps of the inner rooms were trimmed each evening by the lamp keeper, a boy not much younger than Joseph had been when he first came into Egypt, who pressed the wicks carefully down into the oil and touched each one with a small ember from the cooking fire. One by one, the flames came up, steady and gold, and the carved wooden furniture threw long shadows across the plastered walls. The smell of the lamp oil was warm and faintly bitter, the smell of a house that took care of itself, that had enough, that was held together by attention and faithfulness and the routine repetition of small, necessary acts. It was in those fine, ordered days that trouble came, as trouble will, from an unexpected direction, and with a face the household had not thought to guard against. The master's wife had watched the young steward for a long time, and what she felt she decided to act upon. She found him alone in one of the inner rooms, where the light was cool and the linen folded in clean stacks on the shelves, and she spoke plainly. The old story records only that he would not, that he stepped back from what she wanted because his master had trusted him with all things, and this one thing was not his to give. He turned away. He went. In the going, a garment, his outer robe, stayed behind in her hand, the cloth pulling free as he passed through the door into the bright corridor beyond. And then he was gone into the heat of the day, into the open air, and the room behind him was still and silent, and the linen on the shelves lay undisturbed, and the light moved slowly across the floor as afternoon moved toward evening. That is all the story says of that moment, and it is enough. A man who would not, and a door and a garment left behind. The moment passes. But the garment did not pass. It was held up instead, carried out of that room and into the place of accusation, and the words spoken around it were the wrong ones. It is the oldest kind of cruelty, the turning of a thing that was faithfulness into evidence of fault. The captain of the guard came home to a story he had not been there to witness, and in the way of men given a story with seeming proof, he believed it, or acted as though he did. He was angry, and the anger had a name on it, and that name was Joseph. And by evening the young man who had done no wrong was taken from the ordered house to another kind of place entirely. The prison that held the king's prisoners was a place of thick walls and cool shadow, the stones set close and the mortar old and firm between them. It was not a place of active cruelty so much as a place of waiting, long, patient, unasked for waiting, where time moved differently than it did in the bright rooms of a great house. The air inside smelled of the earth itself, of the deep stone that no sun had touched in a very long while, and there was a particular quality of silence in those rooms that was not peaceful, so much as simply very, very still, the silence of a place that had held many men and forgotten none of them. High in one wall, too high to reach and too narrow for more than one man's forearm, a window had been cut through the stone, barred with two crossed rods of iron gone orange with age. In the morning, a single bar of light fell through it and lay across the opposite wall like something placed there deliberately, like a mark made by a careful hand. It crept as the day turned, crossing the rough plaster slowly, touching the floor at midday and fading to gray as the afternoon light thinned. It was the only thing in that room that moved on its own, and the men who waited there learned to read it the way they might have read a sundial, as a sign that the day was still passing, still going somewhere, however slowly. Joseph sat in that light on the first morning as he would sit in many mornings to come, not broken, the old story insists on this, but quietly present, the way a man is present when he has learned that despair costs more than it returns. There was a patience in him that had been schooled first by the long years with the flocks in Canaan, and then by the long years of service in the great house, a patience that was not resignation so much as a kind of deep listening, as if he trusted that the next part of the story was already written somewhere beyond the stone walls, waiting for its time. The keeper of the prison was a man of measured habits and plain speech, and he had seen enough of men in difficult places to know the difference between one who was crushed by his circumstances and one who was not. He watched the young man from Canaan with an interest he did not trouble to conceal, and what he saw in the days that followed was the same thing Potiphar had seen before him, a kind of quiet reliability that extended into every small task, an attentiveness to what was needed and a willingness to provide it. It is told that the keeper of the prison came, in time, to place the affairs of the prison itself in Joseph's hands, as if the young man carried some quality of order that grew wherever he was planted. And so it was that the prison, like the house before it, settled itself around him. Not comfortably, for stone is stone and shadow is shadow, but with a kind of functional peace that was its own small mercy. He distributed the morning rations and kept the tallies straight. He tended to the sick among the prisoners, bringing them water and speaking to them in the quiet way that costs nothing and means everything. The walls did not grow thinner for any of this, and the bars on the high window did not soften, but there was a human warmth inside those walls that had not always been there, and the men in that place knew who had brought it. The seasons did what seasons do. They turned. The Nile, somewhere beyond the walls, rose and fell and rose again, and the birds passed over in their great formations, north, then south, then north, and the heat of summer pressed down on the stone of the city like a great flat hand, and then lifted again into the dry cool of the desert winter. Inside the prison, the light through the high window changed its angle with the months, touching different corners of the room, as if slowly reading the walls. Joseph watched all of it, unhurried, as he had once watched the rain come down across the hills of Canaan from the high pasture above Hebron. He had always had that gift of watching without urgency. It was in the custody of that same prison that the God of his fathers, the story says with its characteristic quietness, was still with Joseph. The same gentle insistence the old tale makes in only the places where it matters most, not as an explanation, but as a thread, felt rather than seen, running through the fabric of everything. The stone walls could not interrupt it. The false accusation had not cut it. It was there in the morning light, and there in the long, still afternoons, and it was there especially in the way the keeper of the prison trusted him, and the prisoners came to him, and something kept going forward that no door had managed to stop. We follow him now through the long middle passage of his prison years, into the morning when the story took one of its quiet pivots, when two new men arrived in the keeper's charge, men from the court of Pharaoh himself, the royal cupbearer and the royal baker, each of them fallen from favor for reasons the old telling does not trouble to explain. They were given over to Joseph's supervision, and he tended to them as he tended to all the others, with the same plain attentiveness, the same steadiness. And then one morning he came to them and saw something in their faces that he recognized. They had dreamed. Their faces were troubled in the way that a dream leaves a face troubled. Not by fear exactly, but by the weight of something seen that refuses to dissolve in the morning light. Something that clings to the waking mind like a scent or a sound half remembered. He asked them, simply and directly, why they looked as they did, and they told him, each in his turn, the shapes of what had come to them in the night. A vine with 3 branches budding and flowering and ripening all at once, and a cup and wine pressed into Pharaoh's hand. 3 white baskets stacked and full of bakery goods, and birds descending from a pale sky. He listened to both dreams the way he had always listened, fully, without restlessness, the way the flocks had once taught him to stand still and let the information of the hillside come in through stillness rather than through searching. The meanings, the story says, came to him not as conclusions he worked out, but as things already known, surfacing like water from a deep place. To the cupbearer he gave words of hope. In 3 days the cup would be back in the royal hand. To the baker he gave words that were harder, and he gave them gently, because a man who brings difficult news with kindness has not made the news worse. He asked only one thing in return, only that the cupbearer remember him when the good days came again. 3 days passed, and the dreams came true in exactly the shapes he had named. The cupbearer restored, the baker not. One went back into the brightness of the palace, the other did not. The stone walls of the prison held their quiet. The bar of light crossed the wall again in the morning as it always did, and the lamp was trimmed again at evening as it always was. And Joseph waited in the only way that the prison allowed, which was patiently, one day at a time, watching the slow crescent of light make its familiar arc across the floor and floor again. The cupbearer had gone back to a world of gold cups and river breezes and the smell of wine, and had not remembered. Not yet. The lamp in the prison inner room burned low as the night deepened, the wick drawing oil slowly up from the dark belly of the clay vessel, the flame dropping to a small blue-orange tongue, and then steadying again, as if deciding to continue. The walls held their silence. The high window showed nothing but a narrow strip of stars, cold and immeasurable, the same stars that arched over the broad black river and over the desert roads going east, and over the terraced hills of Canaan, where old Jacob sat in his tent with a grief that had not yet been told its ending. And here in Egypt, in a room of stone, the young man who had dreamed of stars lay quietly in the dark, and the stars kept watch. It is enough for now to rest here. We follow him now into the long patience of the prison. It was a place kept by the captain of the guard, the same man whose house Joseph had served, and its walls were old, cut from pale stone that held the cool of the night long into the afternoon. The days came and went by the angle of light through a single high window, a bright bar that moved slowly across the floor from east to west, measuring the hours without hurry, as though even time here had learned to move more gently. The old story says he was there many days. Not weeks measured on fingers, but seasons, the acacia flowering and fading outside the walls, the inundation rising and withdrawing, the dry wind of summer giving way to the cooler breath of the planting months. In that turning of seasons, something quieter than escape took root in him, a steadiness, a willingness to be present to the place he was in, to the stone beneath his feet, to the men around him, to the small offices of each passing day. It is told that even in that low place, the God of his fathers was said to be with him, felt not as a voice, not as a vision, but as the quiet steadiness that allowed him to rise each morning without bitterness, to keep his hands useful, to meet each face with care. The keeper of the prison watched, and what he saw was a man who could be trusted, in the way that certain things are trusted, a well-set stone, a lamp that does not gutter in the draught. And so the keeper gave the young man charge over the other prisoners, as Potiphar once had given him charge over an entire household, the pattern repeating in miniature, in stone instead of linen. He brought the morning rations, settled the disputes that rose between men kept too long in close quarters, spoke quietly to those whose fear ran loudest in the dark. He learned every name. The corridor that had been only shadow and echoes became, in small ways, a place someone tended. The bar of light came each morning through the high window and crossed the wall and reached the floor and moved and was gone. And then the stars came, cool and remote, through that same narrow opening. Orion, the Pleiades, the river of light overhead, and Joseph lay on his mat and watched them wheel, those same stars he had watched from the hillsides of Canaan, from the fields of Dothan, from the deck of a trader's cart moving south into the desert. They had not changed. That constancy was its own kind of company. Then one day, the old story marks it quietly, without ceremony, 2 of Pharaoh's officers were brought in under guard and committed to the prison. They were men of high place. One had served as chief cupbearer to the king of Egypt, keeper of the royal wine, the one who pressed the cup into the hand of the most powerful man in the world. The other had been chief baker, master of the royal bread and the royal table. Both had fallen from favor, for reasons the story does not linger over. They arrived troubled, and they were placed in Joseph's care. He tended to them as he tended to all the others, with steadiness, without ceremony, bringing water in a clay jar, making certain they were not cold in the night. And so it was that when one morning he came to them and found their faces drawn and pale, carrying that particular heaviness of a night badly spent, he noticed. He asked, with the directness of someone who has learned that pretending not to see is its own small cruelty, "Why do your faces look so troubled today?" And they told him, each had dreamed a dream, and there was no one to read it. He sat with them. The bar of morning light lay across the floor between them, warm and unhurried. He listened first to the cupbearer, and the dream the man described was a thing of cool shadow and sudden green. There was a vine before him, the man said, and the vine had 3 branches, and as he watched, the branches budded, and the buds blossomed, and the blossoms ripened into heavy clusters of deep dark grapes. He held Pharaoh's cup in his hand, and he pressed the grapes into it, and he gave the cup into Pharaoh's hand. Joseph was still for a moment after the telling, the way a man is still when something clear has come to him. The gift of reading dreams had always rested in him quietly, laid lightly to the same unseen care that had followed him from Canaan to Potiphar's house to this cell of pale stone, never explained, never fully owned, only received. He spoke gently. "The 3 branches are 3 days," he said. "In 3 days Pharaoh will lift you up and restore you to your place, and you will press the cup into his hand as you did before." And then he asked for something, the only asking the story records from his years in the prison, offered without bitterness, without demand, only a quiet placing of a hope in another man's hands. "When it goes well with you," he said, "remember me, mention me to Pharaoh, and bring me out of this place." He said, "I was taken from the land of the Hebrews, and here also I have done nothing that deserves this pit." The word pit fell simply, without anger. He had named it honestly, and then he let it rest. The baker, who had listened, spoke then, perhaps encouraged by the brightness of the first telling, perhaps hoping the same clear light would fall on him. He too had dreamed. In his dream he carried 3 white baskets on his head, stacked one upon another, as bakers carried the bread of the royal household, and the top basket held all manner of baked things for Pharaoh. But birds came, out of the bright sky, swift and indifferent, and ate from the basket on his head, and he could not drive them away. Joseph listened to the whole of it before he spoke, and when he spoke it was with the same gentleness, the same care not to wound more than the truth required. "The 3 baskets are 3 days," he said again, and the symmetry of that number fell across both dreams like a shadow falling equally on 2 stones. But what followed for the baker ran a different way, and Joseph told it plainly and briefly, with sorrow rather than cruelty, and then said no more. The story does not linger here, and neither does the telling. It was said, and it was received. 3 days passed in the measured quiet of the prison, the bar of light moving, the clay jars brought, the cool nights attended by the distant sound of the river city going on without them. And on the 3rd day Pharaoh held a great feast, as the old story says, and in the ordering of that feast both men were remembered. The cupbearer was restored to his position, washed and dressed, and returned to the brightness of the court. The familiar smell of wine and linen and torch smoke, the cup again in his hand. It had come to pass exactly as the telling had said it would. 3 branches, 3 days, the cup lifted and given again. The dream had walked forward into waking life as quietly as light moves across a wall. The cupbearer stood in the hall of Pharaoh, the familiar cool weight of the royal cup in his palm, the smell of pressed grapes rising to him. And somewhere beneath the brightness of that restored life there was the small memory of a stone cell and a young man who had asked one thing. But the old story says, with its characteristic gentleness toward human nature, that the chief cupbearer did not remember Joseph. He forgot him. It is told without judgment, only the plain, soft fact of it. The restored life filled back in around that small memory the way water fills a vessel, quickly, completely, until there was no space left where the remembering might have lived. The hall was bright, the wine was fragrant, the work was familiar and good. And Joseph was not remembered. Back in the prison, the days resumed. The bar of light came and moved and went. The stars returned at their appointed hour. Joseph tended to the prisoners in his care, brought what was needed, settled what could be settled, and waited, not with clenched hands, not with fury, but with the same patient steadiness that the stone walls themselves seemed to hold. He had asked. He had not been remembered. There was nothing to do now but remain, and to remain well, which is its own quiet kind of courage. The seasons moved outside the walls in their old procession. The cool flooding, the green fields, the harvest, the dry heat, the cool again. And within the walls, the same light moved across the same stone, and Joseph remained. The story holds this waiting without explanation, without a consoling word, only the clean, bare fact of the young man in the low place and the time moving around him, forgotten, still here. The dreamer of sheaves and stars, tending clay bowls in a prison, waiting for a door he could not see. It is a tender thing, this waiting, rendered neither as despair nor as easy faith, but as the particular human patience of someone who has seen enough to know that a dream deferred is not a dream undone. The sheaves had bowed once in his sleep on the hills of Canaan. The sun and moon and 11 stars had wheeled and inclined. Whatever those images had meant, they had not yet come to pass. He was 17 when the coat was taken. He was older now, quieter, wearing the prison's plain cloth instead of the fine coat, but the dreams were still there. And far away, across the long road that ran north through the desert and up into the hill country of Canaan, old Jacob sat in his tent with his grief and his remaining sons, and the son he would not part with, Benjamin, the youngest, the one the old man kept near. He did not know where Joseph was. He did not know there was anything to know. The tent was quiet at night, the flocks settled in their folds, the oil lamp burning low. He did not know that the thread of his son's life ran on, unbroken, in a prison by the Nile. So the night deepened over both, the old father in his tent on the dry hills, the young son on his mat in the stone cell, and neither could see what was being slowly shaped around them in the dark. The bar of light had gone. The stars moved in their courses. The Nile breathed below the city. Somewhere in the palace of Pharaoh, a great king lay asleep, and the night was not yet done with its dreaming. And it is enough for now to rest here in the quiet, where the waiting is held gently and the thread runs on. 2 years passed over Egypt like slow water over stone. The Nile rose and fell in its ancient rhythm, flooding the black earth and retreating again, leaving behind the rich silt that fed 10,000 fields. In the prison, the days accumulated quietly, one upon another, like leaves settling to the floor of a still pool. Joseph had learned patience the way a tree learns wind, not by resisting, but by bending and remaining. The cupbearer had returned to his place in the palace, and the memory of the young interpreter had softened and grown faint, the way a dream itself softens in the hours after waking. And then, in the depth of the 2nd year, a night came to the palace of Pharaoh that was unlike other nights. The great king lay in the innermost chamber of his house, beneath linen so fine it moved with the breath of the river wind, and sleep came to him as it always did, deep and complete. And then the dreams began. The first was vivid beyond the common run of dreaming, the colors sharp, the sounds present, the smell of water and reed and mud entirely real. He stood, in the dream, upon the bank of the Nile, where the reeds grow tall and the river grass bends at the water's edge, and the river before him was wide and green and utterly still. Out of that still, green water, 7 cattle came. They rose from the shallows the way large animals do, slowly and with great ease, water streaming from their flanks, and they were beautiful, sleek and heavy and full of flesh, their coats gleaming like dark polished wood in the early light. They moved up onto the bank and began to graze among the reeds, unhurried, content, the soft tearing sound of grass filling the warm air. The river carried the scent of deep water and green growing things, and the cattle moved through the reeds like figures of abundance itself, solid and serene. And then, behind them, 7 more cattle rose from the river, but these were nothing like the first. They were gaunt, hollow-flanked, their hides hanging loose over the ridges of bone, their legs thin and uncertain on the muddy bank. They stood in the reed grass, and the air around them felt different, dry and empty, the way a room feels when something has been taken from it. And the 7 lean cattle came toward the 7 fat ones and opened their mouths and swallowed them, all 7 one by one into themselves, and were no less lean after. They stood in the reed grass, still starved, still hollow, as if the sleek 7 had never been. The king woke. The darkness of the chamber pressed close around him, heavy and warm, and the dream was still behind his eyes with unusual force, the images refusing to recede as dreams usually do into morning vagueness. He lay still, breathing. The lamp on the low stone table had burned down to a small, steady flame, and outside, beyond the great walls, the first birds of Egypt were beginning their pre-dawn calling. The ibis and the hoopoe, and the voices that rise from the riverside marshes before any light appears. He lay in that dark quiet, and the dream lay with him, and he could not unknot what it meant. He slept again, because sleep was not yet done with him. And the second dream came. He stood in a field this time, not by the river but inland, where the grain grows in long orderly rows, the stalks rising straight and tall from the dark earth. On a single stalk there grew 7 ears of grain, and they were golden and full, heavy with seed, each one plump and dense, grain such as a farmer dreams of in the long months of waiting. The warm breath of the field moved over them, and the light was the color of good harvest, amber and deep. But then a hot wind moved across the field, the kind of wind that comes from the deep desert, dry and merciless, carrying no moisture, only heat and grit. And on the same stalk, behind the 7 golden ears, 7 more ears grew, thin and pale and withered, scorched by that desert breath, barely more than husks. And the 7 thin ears reached toward the 7 full ones, and consumed them, folding over them, swallowing their gold into their own pale nothing. The full ears were gone. The stalk stood in the hot wind, bearing only the 7 thin and empty husks, and the field was still, and the wind kept blowing. The king woke again into the darkness of his chamber, and this time he did not sleep. The lamp had burned lower still, its light a bare thread of gold in the vast room, the painted walls receding into shadow above, the lotus and papyrus columns, the river scenes in blue and ochre and white, all of it dim and still. He sat with the 2 dreams around him like presences, and he knew with the certainty one sometimes knows in the hours before dawn that these were not ordinary dreaming. Something in them asked to be understood. Something in them waited. Morning came in through the high, narrow windows in long, pale bars that crossed the polished floor, and the great house of Egypt woke around its king. Word went out before the day was fully bright. The wise men were to be summoned, the dream readers and the learned ones, those who had given their lives to the study of signs and portents, the scholars of Egypt's ancient and venerable art of interpretation. They were gathered, and they came, quietly, with great dignity, their knowledge deep and their intent genuine, and the king told them what he had seen, both dreams, plainly and in full. They listened with the care of people who have spent decades learning to listen. They considered and consulted one another in low voices, and they turned the images over with all the tools their great tradition had given them: the fat cattle and the lean, the full ears and the empty, the river, the field, the wind. But the meaning would not come clear. It was not a failure of learning or of earnestness. Sometimes a dream belongs entirely to a particular moment and will not open itself to any key but the one it was made for. The wise men of Egypt returned their silence to the king, and the king's unease deepened in the morning light. It was then that the cupbearer stepped forward. He had been standing in his proper place throughout the morning, holding his office with the quiet competence that had made him trusted, and the king's distress had worked upon his memory like a hand brushing dust from a surface, revealing what had lain beneath. He spoke with humility, reminding the king that he carried an old fault, a time when he had been sent away, imprisoned, and that there in the prison there had been a young man, a foreigner, who had heard the dream of the cupbearer and the dream of the baker, and whose reading had come true in every particular. We follow the story now as it turns on its hinge, a prisoner and a king, and a morning that had been 2 years in the making. The word went down from the palace into the holding place below the city with the speed of royal command, and the prison that had been Joseph's world for so long was suddenly full of movement and urgency. He was brought out. The story says simply that he was brought out, and there in the antechamber of the prison, before he was taken anywhere, he was given water and a razor, and clean white linen to replace the garments of confinement, and he stood in the cool of a stone room, washed and dressed, the morning air moving over him. The walk from the prison to the palace was not long in distance, but in another sense it was the longest road of his life. The city moved around him. The smell of bread baking in clay ovens, the sound of water being drawn, the hard, bright light of an Egyptian morning falling on mud brick walls and market stalls, and the far glint of the Nile beyond the rooftops. He had not walked in the open city for a long time. He breathed it in, that ordinary world of morning noise and bread smell and river light, and whatever he carried in himself he carried quietly, as he always had. The hall he was brought into was unlike anything the hills of Canaan had ever prepared him for. It was vast in the way that certain old and great things are vast, not merely large, but weighted with time, the ceiling high enough that the lamplight did not reach it, the columns painted in colors that the craftsmen of generations had laid on with devotion, blue lotus and green papyrus, the river birds, the reeds, the ancient signs of a civilization that had been reading the meaning of the world for longer than any living person could trace. The polished floor caught the lamps and gave them back doubled. The air smelled of incense and stone and the river. The king told him the dreams plainly, just as he had told the wise men, the fat cattle and the lean, the full ears of grain and the withered. And the young man from Canaan stood in the great hall in his clean white linen, with all that incense and stone air around him, and listened to every word. He did not pretend to a knowledge that was his own. The story remembers that clearly. He said first, quietly, that the understanding he carried was not his by nature or by study, but came from beyond himself, a gift he held rather than owned. It was a reverent thing to say, and the hall received it in silence. And then he gave the reading, and his voice was steady in the great room. The 2 dreams were one dream, he said. One meaning, given twice for the weight of it. The 7 fat cattle and the 7 full ears of grain. Those were 7 years. 7 years of abundance such as Egypt had seldom seen. The Nile flooding well. The fields deep and generous. Grain beyond the counting of it. Enough to fill every storehouse in the land and still have more. The years were coming. They were close. The land would grow rich in them and full, and the storehouses would swell with the plenty of the earth. And then the 7 lean cattle and the 7 withered ears. Those were 7 years that would follow the good ones, years of famine so complete and so thorough that the abundance of the 7 good years would be swallowed up and forgotten, as the lean cattle had swallowed the fat without showing it. The famine would be heavy over all the land, and the memory of plenty would fade like morning mist. This was what the two dreams were saying, he told the king. 7 years and 7 years, and the doubling of the vision meant it was settled and near. The hall was very still. He continued, and there was a practicality in him that the years had honed, a mind that did not stop at reading, but moved naturally toward provision. A wise and discerning man should be set over the land of Egypt, he said, and officers appointed through the country. And during the 7 years of plenty, a portion of every harvest should be gathered and stored against the 7 that would follow. The grain should be kept in the cities, held in reserve, so that when the famine came, the land would not be destroyed by it, but fed from its own stored abundance. The hall was quiet as stone. Even the lamplight seemed to hold itself still. The meaning had settled into the room the way certainty does, not with noise, but with weight. The king looked at what stood before him in the clean white linen, a young man who had come out of a prison that morning, who had no claim to power and no school of learning behind him, who had spoken without pretension and without hesitation, and whose words had the quality of things that are simply true. Around him the painted columns rose toward their dim and distant ceiling, the river scenes and the lotus moving upward into darkness, and the oil lamps burned in their places, and the hall of the greatest house in the world was filled with the hush that follows the speaking of something that cannot be unsaid. There it rested, the reading given, the hush holding, the two dreams finally opened, and their meaning lying plain in the air of that ancient and magnificent room. The cattle by the river and the ears of grain on the stalk had spoken their long, patient message, and it had been heard. Outside the palace, the city of Egypt went about its morning, the river moving south to north in its old and unhurried way, the fields green in the distance, the sky above the Nile wide and deep and full of light. And in the great hall, the stillness, after understanding, settled like fine dust after a long movement, gently, completely, coming to rest. And it is enough now to rest here in that quiet, where the meaning has been given and the day has only just begun. They brought him from the prison before the sun had climbed far. The stone threshold was still cool beneath his feet, the last of the night's chill clinging to the corridor walls as he passed through them. And then he stepped out into the full warmth of the Egyptian morning, and everything changed. It is told that a king's word, when it moves, moves like the river in flood, unhurried but absolute, reshaping everything it touches. The robes he had worn in the prison were taken from him, and he was washed, and the smell of the cell was gone. Fine linen was laid upon him, white as the ibis feathers along the river, cool and smooth against skin that had known only rough cloth for a long time. The weight of it was different, the fall of it different, the way it moved around the ankles different, and he stood in it quietly, not quite certain yet of what the morning meant. And then a gold chain was brought, the kind worn by those close to the throne, broad and heavy and warm from the hands that carried it, and it was set around his neck, and it rested there against his chest like a spoken word. Then the signet ring, the king's own seal, pressed into the hand of the man he was setting over the land. It is a small thing, a ring, and yet in that ancient kingdom a ring of that kind was every granary key and every storehouse door and every measure of grain from the black soil to the delta, all at once. It slipped over the finger and sat there, warm metal, and the morning moved around it as mornings move around a stone dropped into still water. The world rearranging itself quietly from that point outward, in every direction. We follow him now out into the city, onto the road that opened before the chariot, as a road opens before no other conveyance. Dust rising in a clean plume behind the wheels, the horses stepping high and swift, the air coming fast and warm against the face. Egypt spread around him in all its oldness and its grandeur. Pylons carved with the images of kings long before this king, palm groves thick and dark against the river haze, the distant pyramids on the western edge of the sky, enormous and pale, older than any story he had been told in his father's tent. Heralds went before him, calling out to those in the way to make room, to bow the knee, to acknowledge the second man of Egypt passing on the king's authority. And those who heard came to the side of the road and looked and bent low. He rode through it not in triumph, but in a kind of quiet astonishment, the way a person who has been in a dark room for a long time receives the light, carefully, with his whole self, blinking a little, letting it come. The road opened. The gold caught the sun. The city moved around him in the old way cities move, enormous and indifferent and alive. He was given a name in the tongue of Egypt, a name that fitted the land the way a key fits a particular lock, not his father's name for him, not the name the shepherds had called across the Canaanite hills, but a name of this place, this river, this ancient air. And he was given Asenath for his wife, the daughter of a priest of a very old city, a woman of Egypt's own deep roots. And they came to the house that had been made ready for them in the ordered way of a great household, the rooms swept and oil lamps lit, and bread still warm in the kitchen air. And then the 7 good years began. It is told the way the old stories tell abundance, not loudly, but with a deep and patient satisfaction, the way a farmer feels standing in a field that has come in beyond all expectation, a quiet fullness, almost too much to speak of. The first harvest came in the way the dream had promised, the grain heavy on the stalks, the fields across all Egypt thick to the horizon with it, the smell of ripe wheat rising in the heat of the morning, like something given rather than merely grown, warm and dusty, sweet and generous. The reapers moved through the fields in the early morning when the air was still and the dew had not yet burned away, their curved blades singing against the stalks with a sound like soft rain on dry leaves, a rhythmic, ancient sound that had been the sound of this land's good years for longer than anyone could count. They gathered the cut grain into bundles, and the bundles into carts, and the carts went creaking down the roads between the fields toward the threshing floors, donkeys leaning into the weight, hooves raising small puffs of pale dust with every step. At the threshing floors, the grain was beaten out, spread wide on the hardened earth, and worked until the chaff lifted in the afternoon wind, and the kernels lay clean and pale and heavy as small pebbles underfoot. The smell at the threshing floor was particular, dry and warm, a little sharp, the crushed stalks releasing everything they had held through the long months of growing, all of it settling into the air like a slow exhalation. Then the grain was scooped into sacks and sealed, and the sacks were lifted onto carrying poles and moved toward the great mud brick storehouses rising at the edge of every city. The storehouses were built thick-walled against the heat, their interiors cool and dim, the air inside them carrying the particular smell of stored grain, dense and dry and slightly sweet, the smell of future bread, of seasons held in reserve. He had ordered them built in every province, in every district where the Nile's waters reached, and they rose that first year half full and the second year fuller, their mud brick sides settling into the earth as old things settle, patient and necessary and sure. Workers sealed the ventilation slots with clay against the insects, and inside the darkness the grain kept its goodness quietly. Year by year, the river rose and fell in its unhurried rhythm, flooding the black fields with silt and then withdrawing. And each year the planting followed, and each year the harvest answered, and each year more of it was gathered in and stored, storehouses filling and filling until the scribes stopped trying to number the individual measures and wrote instead in the old shorthand of plenty, as the sand of the sea, they wrote, beyond counting. The Nile that year ran full and green, its banks lush with papyrus, herons standing still in the shallows as if they were carved there. He rode out each year to oversee the gathering, along roads that passed through districts where the names of things were said in a tongue still new to his ear, past temples whose columns were carved with figures of gods older than the oldest story his father had told him, vast and serene, and certain of themselves in the way that very old things are certain, not challenging his own deep knowing, simply there, immense and beautiful, part of the land he had been set to keep. He looked at them with the eyes of a man who has learned that more than one thing can be true and ancient at once. In those years, his first son was born, and he named him Manasseh, a name that carried in its sound something of letting go, the long grief of Canaan, the years of the pit and the prison and the distance from his father's house, all of it still present but held now differently, the way an old wound is held in a healed scar, known, acknowledged, no longer bleeding. He held the child in the lamplight of the new house, and the child was warm and small and smelled of clean cloth and new life, and outside the window the Egyptian night was full of stars. His second son was born not long after, and he was named Ephraim, a name that meant fruitfulness, doubling, the word for a thing that has gone beyond itself and become more than it was, a field that has overspilled its borders with good things. 2 sons, in the land of his exile, in the home that had come to feel, slowly, over the turning of years, less like a foreign place and more simply like the place where he lived. The sound of the river in the morning, the smell of the bread from Asenath's kitchen, the voices of children in the courtyard, small bare feet on warm stone. The 5th year of plenty. The storehouses along the river road were sealed tight now from floor to rooftop, and new ones were still being built further east, where the desert road came in and the caravans passed. Workers mixed the mud brick and stacked it in the sun to dry, and then raised the walls course by course, and inside the finished ones the grain waited in its patient darkness, season after season compressing slowly the oldest measures at the bottom, sweetening with age the way old things do, growing denser and stiller and more entirely themselves. The 6th year. The land was so full of its own goodness that the word for it in every district tongue was the same word, enough, and more than enough, a surfeit of gift, the kind of abundance that makes people almost shy, as though the earth has been too generous and they are not quite sure they deserve it. And yet he kept gathering, kept sealing the storehouses, kept adding measure upon measure to what was already more than could be counted, because he knew, the dream had told him, that the good years were a cup being filled for the years that would empty it. The 7th year came in as the others had, the river flooding full and the fields answering, and the harvest was as heavy as any before it. And then it was done. The good years were finished, not with a sound or a sign, just with the simple fact of a season turning as seasons turn, and the next planting coming in thin, and the next rain not arriving when the farmers looked for it, and the sky staying pale where it should have been full of cloud. The wind that blew across the delta had a new dryness in it, a faint dusty edge that those who worked the land recognized and did not speak of immediately. But the storehouses were full. All those years of patient gathering and careful sealing, it was all there, waiting in the cool, dim rooms, layer upon layer of seasons held in reserve, the plenty of the good years, compressed into stored provision for the lean ones. He opened the storehouses when the need began to be felt, and the grain came out in an orderly way, measured and distributed, carried out on the same roads the harvests had come in on, flowing back toward the people who needed it in the quiet way that well-prepared things do, without drama, without crisis, with the deep satisfaction of a thing done rightly ahead of its time. From every direction the roads to Egypt filled with people, from the eastern deserts, from the southern lands, from the green hill countries to the north and the northeast, where the rains had failed and the wells had dropped and the flocks were thin. Egypt alone had prepared, Egypt alone had bread, and the second man of Egypt sat in the ordered halls of his authority and received them all, and the grain went out in exchange for the things they brought, and no one who came in need was turned away empty. The old dream was walking now, upright in the world, filling the very shape it had been given. He did not know, sitting in those halls, that among the roads from every direction, one road ran from Canaan, from the very hills where he had been a boy, from the valley where his brothers had found him wandering toward them in his coat of many colors, from the land where his father still sat and waited, and did not know what had become of the son he loved. He did not know yet that the dream was not finished, that the sheaves were still arranging themselves, that the stars had not yet finished their slow, inevitable bow. The work of the good years was done. Something else was beginning, and it is enough now to rest here in the patience of that not yet. The 7th year of plenty closed as quietly as a door eased shut in the night. The granaries stood packed to their high mud-brick shoulders, grain sealed beneath clay stoppers, row upon row of amphorae filled with pressed oil, the storehouses breathing the dry, warm scent of abundance. Then a morning came when the Nile ran lower than it should, and the reeds along its banks stood in mud rather than water, and the birds that nested there called out once and fell silent. Something in the air had changed, a faint thinning, a pulling back, the way a tide draws from the shore before it turns for good. The first lean year came in on a hot, dry wind from the east, the kind of wind that carries no moisture but only heat, pressing against the skin like a hand laid flat. The fields that had been so generous began to offer less. The wheat ears that formed along the stalks were thin, their husks paper light, their grains small and hard. Farmers who had not thought about rain in 7 years began to watch the sky. The sky gave nothing back but a whitened, brassy blankness, and the wind continued, steady as a held breath that would not release. By the second lean year, the fields told their story plainly. Where once the grain had stood shoulder high and heavy, now the stems rose brittle and short, and what grain they bore shriveled before harvest. The date palms along the irrigation channels kept their fronds but yielded little fruit, and the channels themselves ran thin, threading through cracked banks that gapped and split like old pottery. A silence settled over the farmland. Not the deep quiet of a winter resting, but a different kind of stillness, the stillness of a land waiting for something that was slow to come. In the dry hills to the north and east, in Canaan, and in all the lands that spread beyond the great delta, the famine pressed more sharply still. The terraced hillsides that had once caught and held the winter rain grew pale and parched. The cisterns emptied early. The goats cropped the last stubble from the stony slopes, and the shepherds moved their flocks from one bare hilltop to another in search of something green, and found less and less. The olive trees stood silvery and patient, as olive trees always do, but even they offered thinner harvests, and the oil in the household jars ran low. The hot wind moved across the bare hills and the empty stubble fields, lifting pale dust, carrying it in long veils across the afternoon light. There was a kind of beauty in it, the way there is always beauty in great empty spaces, even when the emptiness is born of want. The sky in those dry years was extraordinary, vast and clear and deeply blue in the early morning, then bleaching to white at noon, then flushing copper and amber at the day's end, as if the land poured all its warmth back into the air it could no longer hold in its soil. But in Egypt, the great storehouses held. Those deep mud-brick rooms, built in the years of abundance under the young governor's careful ordering, were sealed tight against heat and mice and time. When the granary gates opened at last and the measuring began, The grain that poured from the darkness within was still good, dry and clean, golden even now, smelling of the 7 full years that had filled it. The keepers of the storehouses drew back the wooden beams, and the people came with their empty sacks, and the weighing began, methodical and unhurried, the scales tipping and steadying in the warm morning air. Word moved the way word always moves, carried by merchants and travelers, by the herdsmen who water their animals at the same wells, by the sailors on the reed boats that still made their slow way along the Nile when other rivers had dried to thread. Grain in Egypt. The storehouses were open. There was bread where bread was rare, and the governor who managed it had laid in enough for years for all who came. The word moved north and east and west, into the dry hills and the parched plains, into the camps of the wandering herdsmen, into the households of the settled farmers, and people listened, and people began to move. The roads to Egypt began to fill. From the east and from the north they came, not in desperation, for the story keeps its eye on the patient and the possible, but in the measured movement of people who have heard of something they need and have set their feet toward it. Donkeys with empty panniers, caravans with silver weighed out for purchasing, sacks tied to saddles, ready to be filled. The roads that had been so quiet in the dry months now carried the soft sound of hooves on packed earth, and the creak of rope and leather, and the low voices of men planning what they would buy and how much they could carry home. At the granary precincts, a kind of ordered patience prevailed. The sacks were brought and set in long rows on the ground, and the grain was measured out with the careful attention of scribes who had learned their work in the years of plenty. The scales were bronze and true. The light inside the granary halls was dim and cool after the blazing forecourt, and the smell was extraordinary. The deep, living smell of stored grain, faintly sweet, faintly dusty, the smell of a season held in suspension, waiting to become bread again in someone's hand, far from where it had grown. We travel north now with the story, back up the long road to the dry hills where the story began, where an old man sat in his tent with the weight of years and grief upon him. Jacob, whom the story also calls Israel, felt the famine as every household in Canaan felt it. The lightening of the grain jars, the thinner bread, the careful rationing that comes when a family looks at what it has and measures it against what it needs. He was not a young man. He had buried his wife, had believed he had buried his favorite son. He bore all of this with the steady endurance of the very old, and he kept his household as best he could. When word reached the old man's household that Egypt had grain, Jacob did not hesitate long. The old story says he looked at his sons, strong men, many of them with households of their own now, children and flocks, and the ordinary weight of other lives depending on them, and he asked them why they only stood and looked at one another when there was grain to be bought and a road to walk. The question carried in it everything a father carries: the urgency of provision, the small exasperation of a man who has lived long enough to know that waiting solves nothing, and the deep, familiar love beneath both. But when the 10 brothers made ready to go, there was one who did not take up his staff, one set of sandals that remained by the tent. Benjamin, the youngest, the last son of the wife Jacob had loved most, the last child of that particular tenderness, the only remaining thread that tied the old man to that part of his life, Benjamin stayed behind. Jacob held him back with both the fear and the love of an old father who had lost one son already and could not bear to send this one down an unknown road. Benjamin would wait at home. The 10 would go, and so they went. They walked the long road south as their father had once walked roads like it, as their grandfather had walked before him, as that whole family had always moved through the world, with their animals, their bundles, their silver for buying, and the long habit of the road in their legs. The hills of Canaan gave way to lower, drier ground, and the drier ground gave way to the pale shimmer of the desert margins. And then the air began to change, to carry the faint green scent that means a great river is ahead. They had never been to Egypt. They did not know what waited for them there. They only knew they were thirsty, and the grain jars were empty, and somewhere ahead was bread. Ahead of them, far ahead, in the great administrative hall of the land that had taken him in and raised him up, the man who had put all that grain by was receiving petitioners from the long queue of nations come to buy. He sat in the authority his dream reading had earned him, in linen fine as cool water against the skin, the gold collar of his office across his shoulders, hearing the names of peoples and places called out by his scribes. He did not know that among the many groups coming down the long road were 10 men from the dry hills of Canaan, 10 brothers of a household he had grown up in, whose faces he had not seen in more than 20 years. He did not know yet, but the old story knows, and it carries the weight of that knowledge quietly, the way you carry a lamp through a dark room, not announcing the light, simply moving it forward. 22 years had changed them all. The 10 brothers who set out from Canaan were grown men now, with gray beginning at their temples and the slow gait of fathers who have walked many roads. And the man in the hall of lotus columns had been a boy of 17, the last time they had seen his face, and he was not a boy any longer, and he wore the language and the linen of another country, and they would not know him at all. And yet the dream had always known. That first dream in the hills of Canaan, dreamed by a boy in the dark before dawn, the dream of the sheaves bowing, it had always carried this moment in it, folded small inside the image like a seed inside a husk. All the years between had been the growing season. The pit in the dry ground at Dothan, the caravan and its bells, the long road south, the years in Potiphar's house, the years in prison, the morning before Pharaoh. All of it had been the slow unfolding of what the dream had seen in a single breathless image. The sheaves were still arranging themselves, and now the brothers were on the road, and the road led here. The storehouses of Egypt held enough for the world, and the world had come to fill its sacks and go home fed. At the great receiving yards near the granaries, the donkeys waited in the shade of palm-rib canopies, their eyes patient and dark. The scribes recorded each transaction on their clay tablets with the neat efficiency of a system that had been running for years and knew its work. Grain flowed in arcs of gold from the measuring vessels into the waiting sacks, tied with rope, loaded onto patient animals. It was the oldest of transactions, the hungry meeting the stored abundance of a careful season, and it had a rhythm as old as harvest. Somewhere on that long road south, the 10 brothers of Joseph walked their donkeys through the last of the dry country and felt the air change, and smelled the river, and saw the green beginning at the world's edge. They had silver in their packs for the buying, and they had the hunger of their father's household riding with them, and they had no idea what kind of man they were walking toward, no idea whose hands had built these storehouses, no idea that the name on every scribe's tablet and every merchant's receipt, the name of the governor over all the land, was the name of a boy they had last seen in a dry stone cistern looking up at the bright circle of the sky. And in that dry, round cistern at Dothan, which was empty now of everything but memory, the sky looked the same as it always had, a clean blue circle framed by old stone, utterly indifferent to the story that had passed through it. The rope was gone, the coat was gone, the boy was gone, but the sky above it was the same sky that arched over Egypt and over Canaan and over the long white road between them, the same sky under which the sheaves had bowed and the stars had wheeled toward their slow, unhurried fulfillment. The brothers walked into Egypt. The story held its breath, and it is enough now to rest here at the edge of what comes next. We follow them now into the city of grain, where the storehouses rose like small mountains along the river road, and the air tasted of cut straw and warm stone. The 10 brothers walked in from the desert with their donkeys and their empty sacks, smaller than they had ever felt, countrymen in a city of columns and shadow. Around them the market moved and murmured in a tongue they only half understood, and the dust of 10,000 sandals rose and settled in the flat Egyptian light. The hall where the governor of grain received the peoples was built high and cool. Its lotus columns painted the color of deep water, lamplight burning in iron brackets along the walls. The floor was smooth as river clay underfoot. At the far end, on a carved seat set on a raised step, sat a man robed in fine white linen with a gold collar at his throat and the seal of Pharaoh on his hand. He was not looking at them yet. His face was turned toward a reed scroll spread open across his knee. When they were brought before him, they did what all the peoples of the hungry lands did before the man who held the grain of Egypt. They bowed down low, their faces to the ground, their hands open at their sides. 10 men, bent and still. The hall was very quiet. A lamp flame moved in some small breath of air. And if a man had stood far back in the shadows and known the old story from the hills of Canaan, he might have seen in that long bowing something like a dream of sheaves, quietly keeping its ancient word. He knew them. The old story says it plainly, without ornament. He knew them at once, the shape of them, the way the eldest stood at the front with his jaw set, the particular slant of Judah's shoulders. 22 years had passed, and he knew them as a man knows the hills he grew up in, by their very weather. He said nothing of this. He held still behind his high seat and the gold collar and the language they did not know, and he asked through an interpreter, "Where do you come from?" "From Canaan," they said, "to buy food." Their voices were careful and low. He spoke to them roughly, as a stranger would, who did not trust men appearing from the borderlands. He said they were spies. The word landed in the cool air, and the brothers drew together and answered together, earnest and a little frightened. "No, my lord, we are honest men, 12 brothers from one father, the youngest at home, and one," they said it simply, without seeming to feel the weight of it, "one is no more." He heard the word and let it settle in him like a stone into water. One is no more. He told them they must prove themselves. One of them would stay, held in Egypt, and the rest must go home and return with this youngest brother they spoke of. That would show they were honest men. He watched their faces as the interpreter carried the words across the language between them. And then the brothers turned to one another and spoke in their own tongue, not knowing the governor could understand every word. And they said, "This is because of what we did to the boy long ago when we did not listen." He had to turn away. The old story says he turned aside from them into a room behind the hall and wept. It says only that and nothing more is needed. Imagine a man with his forehead against cool stone, his shoulders very still, the sound of his own breath in a quiet room. Then he washed his face in water from a clay jar, dried it with linen, smoothed his collar, and walked back out into the light of the hall and the waiting men. His face was steady, his voice was even. He gave the order. Simeon was taken from among them and bound before their eyes, not in cruelty, but in the manner of surety, and held back while the 9 were given their grain. The servants filled the great woven sacks with the warm, dry weight of Egyptian wheat. The brothers lashed the sacks to the backs of their donkeys, and the animals shifted and settled under the new load. Then the gate of the city opened, and they walked out into the white afternoon heat. 9, where they had come in as 10, and 1 held behind in a room they could not see. They stopped for the night at a resting place along the desert road, where there was water and a low wall of stone and the smell of dry grass. One of the brothers opened his sack to give his donkey fodder, and felt something hard and cool in the grain near the mouth of the sack. He drew it out and held it up, and it caught the last of the evening light. It was his silver, the very weight of coin he had paid in Egypt. He did not understand it. He set it in his palm and looked at his brothers. There was a long silence. The donkeys moved and breathed. The stars were beginning to appear, one by one, in the darkening sky above the road. The brothers looked at one another over the weight of silver, and no one could say what it meant, whether it was mercy or a trap, whether they were already in some trouble they could not name. The fear in it was genuine and real, and underneath the fear was something else, softer and harder to hold, a sense that the day's events were more than they could fully see. In the morning, they went on. The road home climbed out of the flat river country and into the drier hills, the air growing thinner and the stones growing pale under the sun. With every step they carried the grain and the silver and the fear of what waited in Egypt and the ache of Simeon behind them and the question that none of them could answer yet: would their father let them take Benjamin, the youngest, the last of the two sons of Rachel, the one their father kept nearest to himself? When they came to their father's tent, the telling of it was long and difficult. They poured out the story, the rough-speaking governor, the word spy, the demand for a youngest brother, Simeon held as bond. Jacob heard it all and said nothing for a time. Then they opened their sacks, and every man found his silver returned, each bag with its own small weight of coin at the mouth, and their father's face changed again at the sight of it, the strangeness of it. He sat with his hands in his lap and the silver on the ground before him. Jacob said, "You have robbed me of my children. Joseph is gone. Simeon is gone. And now you would take Benjamin." It was the grief of a very old man, a man who had carried one loss so long it had grown into his breathing, and now the shape of that loss was being pressed again. He held Benjamin close with the word of a father who has lost too much already. The tent was quiet. Outside, the flocks moved in the dry heat, and a goat bell rang once and then was still. No one could answer him. Time passed. The grain from Egypt fed the household through the season, and as long as there was grain, Jacob did not speak again of returning south. But the famine was long, as the governor had said it would be. The storerooms grew light, the baskets grew shallow, the children's bowls were not as full, and one morning the old man said to his sons, "Go down again, buy us a little food." The hills outside were the color of chalk. The wells were lower than they had ever seen them. Judah was the one who spoke plainly. He said, "The man was clear. We cannot see his face unless our brother is with us. Send Benjamin with us, and we will go and buy food, and I will be surety for the boy, I myself. Let me bear the blame if harm comes to him." The old man listened. Outside, a dry wind moved through the tent ropes, and the dust shifted across the threshold. Jacob sat with the weight of it, the same weight no parent should have to hold twice. And at last, he yielded. He told them what to bring: a gift for the governor, a little balm, a little honey, spices and myrrh and pistachio nuts and almonds. The best of the land still had to offer, small and precious against the hard time. "Take double silver," he said. "Carry back the silver found in your sacks. Perhaps it was an oversight. Take your brother and go." He blessed them as they stood to leave, and his voice was the voice of a man trusting what he could not hold, sending out all he had left into a road he could not see. And so they went, 10 brothers and one youngest, 11 on the road south, the road that had carried them before, and that now carried all the remaining hope of their father's house. Benjamin walked among them, young, unknowing, steady. He had never been to Egypt. He had never seen the great river, or the columns of its halls, or the gold light off the water at morning. He carried none of the old guilt the others carried, only the clean weight of youth and the gift bundles on the donkey beside him, and the dry Canaanite hills falling away behind. He saw them coming from a distance. The old story says a steward brought word, 11 men from Canaan, one of them younger than the rest. And when Joseph saw that Benjamin was among them, he gave an order that surprised his servants. "Bring these men to my house, prepare a meal. They will eat with me at midday." The servants moved to obey. The brothers, brought now toward a great house rather than a public hall, were afraid again, not understanding the invitation, whispering to one another that the silver must be why they were being brought inside. They explained themselves to the steward at the door, hurrying to speak of the silver found in their sacks, holding it out. "We brought it back, every coin. We do not know how it came there." The steward heard them and said simply, "Peace. Do not be afraid. Your God and your father's God has given you treasure in your sacks. I received your silver." He brought Simeon out to them, and water was brought for their feet after the road and fodder for the animals, and they rested there in the cool of a courtyard, arranging their gifts, waiting for midday. When he came in, they brought him the gifts from Canaan, the balm and the honey and the spices and the nuts, and they bowed before him again as they had bowed in the hall of grain. He asked after their welfare, and then he asked after their father. "Is the old man still living?" They said, "Your servant, our father, is still alive and in good health." And then his eyes found Benjamin, the son of his own mother, and something moved in him that was larger than the room could hold. He said to him, "God be gracious to you, my son." Then he went quickly out to a room alone and wept there a second time. He composed himself at last, washed his face in the cool water of a stone basin, and came back into the light as the governor he was, steady, measured, his emotion pressed down beneath the authority of his office like a coal beneath ash. The meal was laid out in the great hall, bread and oil and roasted grain, bowls of lentils darkened with cumin, figs glistening in their own sweetness, the air carrying a warm scent of coriander and beeswax from the lamps already kindled along the colonnaded walls. The brothers were seated before the table in a wonder of ordered arrangement, the eldest to the eldest's place, the youngest to the youngest's, each in the rank of his birth, and they looked sidelong at one another with quiet astonishment. For how could the governor of Egypt know the order of their years? They did not ask. They sat in the warmth of the hall and breathed in the scent of the food and felt, for the first time since they had first set foot on Egyptian soil, something approaching ease, as though a wind that had long blown cold had finally stilled. And when the portions were carried from the governor's table to theirs, Benjamin's portion was set before him 5 times as great as any of the others, a heap of bread and roasted grain and fruit that rose like a small hill at his place, more than a young man could eat in a day. The brothers looked at it and said nothing, only exchanged glances across the length of the table. The lamps swayed very gently above them. They drank, and the evening grew warm around them, and they were at ease, not knowing how close to the shore of something enormous they were resting. But we must go back up the road, back across the desert, back to where this second journey had its beginning. For Benjamin was not always among those who would go down. There had been weeks first, long and difficult weeks in the tents of Canaan, where the sacks from the first journey had grown lighter and lighter, and the animals had grown thinner on the brown hillside grass, and the mornings had come with a cold that felt emptier than cold. Jacob had known, with a father's reluctant knowledge, what the running low of grain meant. Still he had not spoken of it. At last the grain was nearly gone, and Jacob said to his sons, "Go down again, buy us a little food." And Judah had spoken then with a quietness that was not argument so much as a plainly stated truth. The governor had said in his own words that they would not see his face again unless their youngest brother came with them. Without Benjamin, the road to Egypt was a road to nothing. Jacob heard this and set his jaw and looked away, out through the tent opening to the pale hills, and the silence between father and sons stretched long and thin as smoke. Jacob said, "Why did you treat me so ill as to tell the man you had another brother?" And Judah answered, and Simeon and the others answered, that the man had asked after their family, asked with a precision that gave them no room to conceal, and they had only spoken what was true. They could not have known he would say what he said. The lamp between them gave a small, dry flutter in the tent's breath. Jacob's hands did not move. He was a father who had folded one son of Rachel into the earth of his memory, and to send the last one down into the world felt like tearing open a seam that had only just, after years, begun to hold. Then Judah rose and came a step closer to his father and spoke simply, "Send the boy in my care, and we will rise and go, so that we and you and our little ones may live and not die." He said, "I will be a pledge for him. If I do not bring him back to you and set him before you, then let the blame be mine forever." His voice carried neither plea nor demand, only a settled willingness, the weight of a man staking his own name as surety for his brother's life. The old man looked at him a long moment in the lamp's soft, unsteady circle. Jacob gave way at last, not with joy, but with the quiet exhaustion of a man who has argued with necessity until necessity has won. He said, "If it must be so, then do this. Take of the land's finest things as a gift for the man, a little balm, a little honey, aromatic spices and myrrh, pistachio nuts and almonds. Take double silver in your hands to return what was put back in your sacks. Perhaps it was an error. And take your brother." The word cost him something. He spoke it plainly. Then he turned his face away, and the lamplight held the lines of his grief without naming them. So they rose in the early morning, the air cold and thin, the sky above Canaan still holding the last ash of night, and loaded the donkeys with their gifts and their double silver and their empty sacks, and with Benjamin among them, the youngest, his face turned toward a road he had never traveled. The hills of Canaan grew smaller behind them as the light grew. By midday the road was dust and the sun a flat white weight above the brown plain. By evening the smell of the land had changed. Something greener, something older, something carried on the warm breath of the river country, and Egypt lay ahead, immense and patient, as it had always lain. When the governor saw Benjamin among them, his own mother's son, the child of the same beloved woman, he said to the steward of his house, "Bring these men in, and slaughter an animal, and make ready, for they will dine with me at noon." The steward did so, and led the brothers through the wide gate and into the courtyard of the great house, where the air was cool under an awning of palm fiber matting, and the stones of the floor had been swept smooth. And the brothers were afraid, stepping inside, afraid that the business of the silver found in their sacks had followed them here like a debt unpaid. They spoke to the steward at the door, pouring out their explanation in careful words about the silver found in their sacks on the last journey, how they had brought it back doubled, how they truly did not know how it had come to be there. The steward heard them and was gentle with them. "Be at rest, do not be afraid," he said. "Your God and the God of your father must have put treasure in your sacks. I received your silver." And he brought Simeon out to them, and Simeon came through the door blinking in the open light, thin and quiet, restored to his brothers after the long months of waiting. They were given water to wash their feet after the long road, and fodder was brought for the donkeys, the animals lowering their heads into the dry hay with a soft, grateful sound. And the brothers arranged their gifts on a cloth to be ready for the governor's arrival at noon. The bundles of spice and the small clay pots of honey and balm sat quietly on the cloth, and the brothers sat near them in the cool of the house, resting after the journey, speaking in low voices. their sandals set aside, their feet finally still. Around them, the house hummed with the quiet industry of preparation, water heating, bread baking, the warm scent of cumin drifting from somewhere within. When the governor came in and they offered him their gifts, he asked after their father, "Is the old man well? Is he still living?" And they said, "Yes. Your servant, our father, is alive and in good health." And they bowed low before him. His eyes moved to Benjamin, and he asked, "Is this your youngest brother, the one you told me of?" And without waiting for the answer, he said to Benjamin, "God be gracious to you, my son." Then he had gone quickly to his own room, as the story remembered it, and wept there, for the sight of the boy was more than the governor could hold without breaking. He had dried his face and returned, and now the meal was laid and the hall was warm. They ate and drank together in the lamplight of that hall, the brothers and the governor, though the governor ate apart as was the custom of his rank, and the food was more than they needed, and the wine was poured freely. And for the first time in all those months, the world felt neither dangerous nor strange. Benjamin sat at his place with his portion heaped before him and ate in a careful wonder. The lamps burned steadily. The long day folded into evening, and evening into a kind of peace, and the brothers lay down to sleep that night in the house of a great man who had shown them only kindness, not yet knowing who he was. In the morning, when the first pale light was coming through the high windows of the storerooms, the governor told his steward to fill the men's sacks with grain, as much as they could carry, and to put each man's silver back in the mouth of his sack, and to put his own silver cup, the one he drank from, into the mouth of the youngest brother's sack, along with the silver for his grain. The steward did as he was told, moving in the quiet dark of the storehouse while the brothers still slept, the great poured grain making its soft rushing sound, the silver cup settling down among the grain without a word. The brothers rose with the morning and loaded their donkeys and went out through the gate of the city as the sun was still low and the road was cool with the last of the night's breath. They were going home. The gates of the city fell behind them, the mud-brick walls and the pylons and the smell of the river giving way to the open air of the road north, and the brothers moved freely for the first time in what felt like a long season. Benjamin beside them, the road home under their feet. They did not know yet what lay in Benjamin's sack. The morning was quiet, and the road was wide, and the donkeys walked steadily. They had not gone far, a few miles perhaps, the city still a low line of mud and stone behind them, when the steward came after them on the road, and his voice stopped them. He said, "Why have you repaid good with evil? Why have you stolen my master's silver cup, the one from which he drinks?" The brothers turned on the road, astonished, and said with a certainty that came from their innocence, "Far be it from us. We returned the silver we found in our sacks. Why would we steal silver or gold from your master's house? Let the one among us in whose sack it is found be put to death, and the rest of us will be your master's servants." The steward said, "Let it be as you say, but only the one in whose sack it is found will be my master's servant. The rest of you may go free." They lowered their sacks to the ground at once, each man opening his before the steward, beginning with the eldest and ending with the youngest. And the steward searched from sack to sack down the line. The grain poured out at each opening with its dry, warm sound, and silver glinted in each mouth, and each sack was clear. And then he reached Benjamin's sack last and put his hand in among the grain, and the cup was there, cold and certain, drawn out into the morning light. They tore their garments, the old gesture of grief, the cloth rending in their hands in the open air of the road, and they loaded their donkeys again in silence, and every one of them turned back toward the city. Not one stayed on the road to the north. Not one went home without his brother. They walked back together through the morning light, the city walls growing ahead of them again, the pylons rising, the smell of the river returning, Benjamin in the middle of them, not alone. The road back was the same road they had come by, but it felt entirely different. Narrowed, tender, the brothers walking close. Judah came first, through the door of the great house, and the brothers came in after him and stood before the governor, who was still there, waiting. Standing in the middle of the room, the light from the high windows, laying itself across the floor in long, pale bars. The room was quiet. The silver cup was on the table. Judah looked at the man who held all power over them in this land. And then he looked at his brothers, and then he found in himself whatever it was that had to be said. Not an argument, not a plea exactly, but the plain shape of who they were and what they could not do. He opened his mouth, and the room listened. Judah's voice was low and careful, as a man treads a narrow path above a long drop. He told it plainly. Their father, old and worn, who had loved one son and lost him, and who now loved the last son of that same mother more than breath itself, so that if the boy did not come home, the old man's gray would go down into the earth with sorrow. He spoke without ornament. The lamplight held still on the plastered walls, and the grain smell of Egypt lay faint and sweet beneath everything, and the room was utterly quiet around the shape of what he was saying. He said it simply at last, "Take me instead. Let the boy go home to our father, and let me, Judah, stay in his place as a servant in this land." He could not go back and watch the grief that would come over his father if Benjamin did not return. He could not carry that. The words settled into the room like stones into still water, and nothing moved for a moment. Not the flame, not the dust drifting in the shaft of light from the high window, not the breath of anyone who stood there listening. The governor had been still as carved stone through all of it, but Judah's words had broken something open that could not be held shut anymore. A long trembling ran through the man seated before them, the way a deep-rooted tree shudders before it lets go of a season, all at once, quietly, without warning. He turned his face aside for a moment, and then he straightened, and then he spoke. And what he said to every Egyptian in the room was a single word that meant, "Go, leave. All of you, go." They went, and the doors drew closed, and there was no Egyptian left in that room. The story says no one from the household remained. Not a steward, not a servant, not a guard at the threshold. Only the brothers and the man who held them, alone together in a high-ceilinged room in the great city of Egypt, with the lamplight pooling gold on the tiled floor and the sound of the city going on, distant and indifferent, outside the thick walls. And then the governor wept. He wept so that it was heard outside, in the corridors, in the courtyard, great weeping, uncontained. He lifted his face, streaming with tears, and he said in their own tongue, the tongue of Canaan, the tongue of their father's house, the tongue of childhood and flocks and hill country mornings, words they had never expected to hear in Egypt from any mouth, least of all this one. The words were not many. They did not need to be many. He said, "I am Joseph," and then very quietly, as if the question cost him everything, "Is my father still alive?" The flame on the lamp swayed once in the change of breath that passed through the room, and then it held. The brothers could not answer him. The story says they were troubled. The word in the old telling holds something beyond surprise, something closer to the feeling of ground that was always solid, suddenly showing itself to have been hollow all along. They stood in their stillness and their disbelief, and the silence in that room was of a kind that only comes once. He said it again, gently, and this time he said his own name, and Benjamin's in the same breath. "Your brother, the one you sold into Egypt," and the plain truth of it hung in the lamp-warmed air between them. And then he did something the story holds as the most tender thing he did in all of it. He gave the forgiveness before any of them had found the breath to ask. Do not be grieved, he said, and do not be angry with yourselves because of what was done. He said it as a man who has thought about this a long time in quiet rooms, in the dark of a prison, in the high halls of a palace, who has carried the question until the answer came clear and clean, and now offers it simply, freely, without price. What was done was turned somehow in ways none of them could have foreseen toward the saving of many lives. He did not say it to explain, and he did not say it to excuse what they had done. He said it the way a person holds a door open, quietly, so others can come through. And it was enough. The strange, long, painful road from that dry hillside in Canaan to this room in Egypt had brought them all to the same place. And they were here, and he was here, and it was not loss that had the last word in this room tonight. It was this, a brother, alive, weeping, holding out his arms. The whole of that old injury dissolved in the sound of his crying. He fell upon Benjamin's neck and wept, and Benjamin wept with him. The two of them who shared a mother, the youngest and the one who was lost, holding each other in the middle of Egypt as the lamp burned on and the city breathed its enormous ancient breath outside. Then he kissed his brothers, each of them, and wept over them. And after the weeping, the room was different. Softer, quieter, as a field after rain holds a stillness that was not there before. The brothers found their voices again, slowly, the way warmth comes back into cold hands held near a fire. They talked. The old story does not tell us all they said, and perhaps that is right. Some things spoken in the aftermath of a long grief are only for those in the room. But it is told that they talked, and that Joseph's mind and heart, even in that tender hour, turned almost at once toward their father. The old man was somewhere to the north in the dry hill country, waiting in not knowing, believing one son long dead and the others in a foreign land with strangers. Every day of that waiting was a day too many. Go quickly, Joseph told them. Tell my father I am alive. And bring him to me, he said. Bring all of you, your households, your children, your flocks, your everything, down to Egypt, and I will settle you in Goshen, that green, wide country near the delta, where the pasture is good and the water is near, and I will care for you through all the years of famine that still remain. There are 5 years yet of the dry wind and the empty fields, he said, and in those years I will provide for you, so that none of you and none of what you love shall come to want. He said it not as a lord granting favor, but as a brother making a promise. The news of this weeping and this meeting had gone ahead of them through the corridors and the courtyard to the household of Pharaoh. It pleased Pharaoh, the old story tells us, and it pleased those around him. Word came back to Joseph. Let your brothers load their animals and go back to Canaan, and let them bring their father and come. And Pharaoh, great and generous in his pleasure, sent his own word after that. Do not concern yourselves with your goods. The best of this land is yours, and wagons will be sent, the wide ox-drawn wagons of Egypt, to carry the old man and the children, and whoever cannot walk the long road. We follow the brothers now as they load those wagons, and the scene is all texture and warmth. The rough woven sacks filled to their mouths with Egyptian grain, the smell of flour and dried fruit and good things pressed upon them for the road, the creak of axlewood, the low sound of oxen setting their weight into a load. Joseph had given each of his brothers a change of garments, fine cloth from the storehouses, and to Benjamin he had given more, silver and 5 changes of fine cloth, a gift upon a gift, the love of a brother made tangible in the weight of it. For their father he had sent a separate gift, 10 donkeys loaded with the good things of Egypt, and 10 more carrying grain and bread and provisions for the journey north, a caravan of care, of a father's needs thought of in every detail. The old man had lived on the edge of want through the famine. Now Egypt itself was coming up the road to feed him. Joseph had sent ahead what words could not carry. Evidence, abundance, the smell and the weight of a son who was alive and thinking of him and had not forgotten a single thing. He sent them off at the gate with one last word, spoken quietly, almost to himself. Do not quarrel on the way. It was a gentle thing to say, almost fond, as if he knew them still, knew the long road north would give tired men space to turn old fears over in their minds, and he wanted none of that. Go home, tell him, bring him, come back. That was the whole of it. The wagons moved, the donkeys moved, the road reached north out of the city and into the open desert, and the brothers rode, carrying news so large it had no frame yet to fit inside. The road was long, and the sun crossed over them, and the shadows of the laden animals stretched east and then shortened and then stretched west, and still they went. The Canaan hills waited far off, the color of old copper in the late light, shaped the same as they had always been, utterly unmoved by what had happened in Egypt. The world outside, a great story never knows it is outside one. The dust of the road was the same dust, the thorns along the edges were the same thorns, the dry wind off the hills the same wind, and the men riding through it were altogether changed. They came to Hebron in the evening, when the light lay low and amber over the terrace slopes and the cooking fires were being set. Jacob, Israel, the old man their father, was there in the shadow of his tent, a figure who had grown quieter with the years of grief, a man who had lived beside absence so long that presence had to announce itself twice before he believed it. They came to him and they told him, Joseph is alive. He is alive, and he is great in Egypt, and he has sent for you. The words fell around the old man like something he had no vessel to hold. His heart was numb. The old story says plainly that he did not believe them, could not at first. The mind protects its wounds, and this man had shaped his grief for Joseph across more than 20 years until it was as familiar as his own name. But then they showed him the wagons. The great wooden Egyptian wagons standing at the edge of the camp in the evening light, solid and undeniable, smelling of cedar and rope and grain and the Nile country. And they told him all the words Joseph had said, and his spirit revived. The story gives it exactly that word, revived, like something that had been banked low, catching light again. Israel rose. Enough, he said, or something near enough to enough. My son Joseph is alive. I will go and see him before I die. The sentence is one of the shortest in the whole long story and one of the most final. A man who had stopped expecting anything now expected the one thing. The camp began to stir around him. Animals, packs, children, the practical business of a whole household gathering itself to move. Outside the tent, the stars came out over Canaan, the same stars that had wheeled over the boy in his dreams long ago. And the night was cool, and the air smelled of dust and dried grass and the far-off scent of change. And so the wagons that Pharaoh had sent turned south again, loaded now not with grain, but with everything a family carries when it is leaving one life and traveling toward another. Animals and bedding and the small, irreplaceable things of a household. And the old man himself in the shade of a canopy, wrapped in his cloak, his face turned south toward Egypt, toward a son the whole weight of his grief had been told was gone. The road unrolled before them. The stars rose and fell. The great, slow, tender journey of this story was not over. It was opening once again into something new. And it was enough, for now, to rest here in the traveling. The wagons came up into the hill country of Canaan like a rumor made solid, wide wheels creaking over the dry stone road, the oxen patient and heavy-footed, their breath warm in the morning air. And before them ran the brothers, breathless with the news they had not dared believe themselves until they saw the wagons. Joseph is alive. He is alive, and Lord over all Egypt, and he has sent for you. The old man Jacob heard the words, and his heart went utterly still, as if a long wind had finally ceased. He could not believe it. The word sat before him like a stone he could not yet lift. Joseph alive, Joseph in Egypt, Joseph a ruler over the great land of the Nile. He was an old man, and grief had been his long companion, and the mind that has carried sorrow long is slow to set it down. He sat at the door of his tent, the goat hair curtains still against the quiet air, the hills amber and dry around him, the flocks at the edge of the valley, the world holding its breath. Then he saw the wagons. He rose from where he sat and walked to them and laid his hands on the rough-hewn wood, still warm from the long road, and he felt the grain of it under his palms, and it was real. Egyptian timber, Egyptian rope, Egyptian grain sacked and waiting in the bed. Pharaoh himself, the brothers told him, had commanded these wagons. And at that touch of solid wood, something in the old man that had been locked for many years began very slowly to open. "It is enough," he said. Only those 3 words, quiet as water settling in a deep jar. "My son Joseph is alive. I will go and see him before I die." The grief that had folded itself around him for so many years, the coat stained, the long silence, the face he had not let himself stop imagining, all of it shifted, not gone yet, but no longer the whole weight of the sky. He stood in the late morning light, the wind lifting the edge of his robe, an old man breathing differently than he had breathed in a very long time. We follow them now, the whole household, down from the hill country and south toward Egypt, down through the pale terraces and the dry valleys, the flocks before them raising a soft haze of dust, the children riding in the wagon beds or running alongside, the bundles piled high, the donkeys loaded with what the family carried of its life. It was the kind of departure that feels less like leaving than like arriving somewhere you have been moving toward without knowing it. The road turned, and the hills of Canaan fell slowly behind. The land changed around them as they traveled. The pale limestone gave way to sand, and then the sand began to soften, and a green scent came on the air before they saw the source of it. The first reed-lined channels, the first dark soil, the low palms fringing the horizon. Egypt opened before the household of Jacob the way a story opens when it has been long in the dark and finally finds its light, gradually, and then all at once, and with a tenderness that was almost difficult to hold. And then he came. A chariot on the road ahead, moving toward them through the green and gold of the land of Goshen. And the old man knew before anyone told him, and he stood at the edge of the wagon road with the wind off the river moving through his gray beard and his hands open at his sides. The chariot stopped. A figure descended, and the son who had been lost was there, in the road, and they held one another, and neither spoke, because there was nothing that words were yet large enough to carry. They wept there together a long while, the old father and the son. And the old story says that Joseph wept so that the sound of it was heard by those nearby, and yet it was not the weeping of sorrow, but the weeping that comes when the heart has been holding something too large for it to hold and is at last allowed to set it down. The flocks grazed at the edge of the road. The palm leaves moved. The whole long, slow journey of this story had been traveling toward this single moment on the road, and now it had arrived, and it was enough. And so the family of Jacob came to dwell in the land of Goshen, in the green pasture land by the river, near enough to Joseph that the years ahead would be years of nearness rather than separation. The famine still lay over the world beyond. The dry wind still turned the dust of other fields, but here the flocks found grass, and the children found space to run, and the lamps were lit each evening in the tents and the houses of mud brick, and the household was whole. Something long broken had been quietly, tenderly mended. All the threads of the long story lay quietly gathered now. The brothers who had carried their silence like stones for so many years were at last unburdened. They had heard from Joseph's own lips that he held nothing against them, that the grief and the pit and the years were somehow woven into something none of them had been able to see from inside it. The dreamer's forgiveness had been entire. No condition, no accounting, only the open hands and the tears. And in that open space, the family had room to breathe again. The old man Jacob, whom the story also calls Israel, spent his last years in that green country with his son beside him, and it is said he had not thought to hope for such a thing. There is a kind of gladness that arrives so late it is almost past believing, and yet is real, and is sweet precisely because of the long waiting. He sat in the shade of a palm in the good land, and the river moved nearby with its ancient, unhurried sound, and his son Joseph's hand was in his hand, and that was all the world he needed. And the dreamer's dreams had all come quietly true, not as he had imagined them in the hills of Canaan as a boy, bright and sudden and proud, but slowly, tenderly, the way grain grows, in the dark first, and without any announcement, and only visible when you look back at the whole long field from a distance. The sheaves had bowed, the stars had kept their course, the dreams had moved through betrayal and prison, and plenty and famine, and come home at last to this. A family fed, a family held, a family whole. The long story has come round at last to gladness. The family is gathered, the famine will end. The children of the household will grow in the green land of Goshen, with the river always near. The dreamer who was put in a pit and sold and imprisoned and raised up had been brought by the longest and kindest of roads to this place. Enough food, enough love, enough forgiveness, and his father's living hand in his. The old grief is healed. The lamps burn low around the sleeping household, and it is enough now to rest. In a quiet field at the edge of the settlement, the sheaves stand the way they stood in the dream, upright in the golden evening air, the heads full and heavy, the long journey of their growing done. There is no dreaming boy standing among them now, only the wheat itself, still and golden in the cooling hour, and somehow that is more peaceful than any dream had been. The symbol returned to the earth returned to abundance, the dream no longer needed, because the thing itself has come. Above the sleeping land, the stars come out one by one, the same stars that shone over Canaan and over the pit and over the prison and over the granaries of Egypt, unhurried as they have always been, as they will always be. The sun and the moon are below the horizon now, and the 11 bright points of light are at rest in the deep of the sky, and there is nothing left for them to foretell. The story they were given to carry has arrived at its harbor, and the night is soft and wide and still. In the courtyard, the wagons stand unloaded and at rest, the great wooden beds empty now, the oxen long since gone to their stalls, the harness coiled and hung on a peg by the gate. They carried a family out of sorrow and down into this. They did their work. They stand in the mild Egyptian dark, dew just beginning to form on the wood, the night around them utterly quiet, and there is something in their stillness that is the stillness of a thing completed, a labor come to its rest. And in a lamplit room of the household, a room of mud brick walls still faintly warm from the day, a room that smells of wool and cedar and the good dark earth of Goshen, the coat that was once the pride and the grief of a whole family lies folded on a cedar chest, its many colors muted now in the low light, its long life of meaning gently set down. It is only cloth. It was always only cloth. And yet there was a story in it, and the story is done, and the coat is at rest. The lamp on the table breathes its small breath, a thread of warm orange light, a slow trembling flame, the oil running low and lower still. The household sleeps. The children are safe. The father and the son are near. Outside, the river moves in its ancient dark, unhurried as it always has and will. The flame bends once, twice, and then it is a glow, and then it is an ember, and then a single curl of smoke rising into the quiet air, and then nothing, only the dark and the peace and the rest. And so the lamp burns low on the story of Joseph. Thank you for resting with us tonight. Until our next story, Lullaby Atlas. Sleep well.